Hello, good morning everyone. If we can just, sorry, I apologise again. If we can, I think we're just slightly after 10. If we can commence now, that would be good, thank you. So good morning to everyone, I hope you're all well, and it's very good to see you for the first time for Audit Committee this year. So we have obviously our directors with us today, and for us to go through our assurance reports, and we will look forward to doing that. So you can just turn to the agenda, and we have apologies for absence, Rob.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. We received apologies from Councillor Skinner and Mr Ian Hallenby. Thank you.
Thank you. Item 2, declaration to members' interest. Have we had any members to declare any interest? No, thank you. And so if we can now move on to the fourth item, which is the combined assurance reports. And obviously, so this is our opportunity really to have each of our directors give us a sort of their view of how we are progressing, and then our chance to get some assurances from what they've told us in terms of changes from last year and new developments, and what risks and opportunities we're going to look forward to in the forthcoming months. So on that note, I think perhaps if we could we turn to Debbie just to start us off, Debbie?
We agree the minutes.
Oh, we did. I do apologise, Rob. Did we? I do apologise. We didn't. I do apologise. Sorry, Debbie. Yes. Can I have approval of last meeting's minutes? Thank you, Mark. Thank you. All those in favour? Thank you. Do apologise. Thank you. Over to you, Debbie. Sincere apologies.
Great, thank you very much. Keen to get onto the combined assurance status report. So thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here in person with colleagues from the corporate leadership team to go through the combined assurance status report. We always really enjoy this session, I think, coming and talking to you face to face about reflecting on what challenges we faced and what we feel are our successes, but then also to look towards the future and really sort of share and get a bit of challenge and around the sort of areas that we think are our risks going forward and what our mitigations are around those risks. So I suppose want to summarise the sort of 2021-22. There is no doubt it's continued to be a challenging year. We've obviously had the challenges around the global pandemic to deal with, which has had a significant effect on the whole of our workforce, but on particular sectors of our workforce without a shadow of a doubt. But I have to say, on the whole, I'm really proud about how our workforce has responded to those challenges. Clearly, many of our workforce are tired, particularly those working within the social care sector and in our emergency services, who've really had to step up during the pandemic. But they've responded incredibly well, and I'm very proud of them, but recognise that we need to really continue to support them moving forward. And to that effect, I suppose, and we have seen, and we will, I think, continue to see labour shortages, not necessarily across the whole of the council and our contracted services, but across many of our services. And again, I'll talk that through when we look forward looking. But certainly we have had labour challenges, again, in the adult care sector, in the children's care sector, in the children's health sector and the adult health sector, as well as in the transport and the highway sectors as well. When staff have needed to be redeployed to meet business continuity, they've responded and been redeployed across the council and gone wherever we've wanted people to work. So the response to that business continuity has been amazing, which meant that we've continued to deliver on all of our activities. And I suppose because of that, then, we're pleased to say that the combined assurance document has continued to receive substantial assurance, with only the red risks increasing by 1% and those rated as green up from 55 to 59%, which does demonstrate that I think our governance risk and control framework is robust and that controls are in place. And again, I think as the exec directors and myself get more familiar with the framework, we're getting a bit more consistency of practice and consistency of judgment as we go along, recognising that many of these factors are informed through objective managerial judgment. So just really, again, sort of looking back, clearly we've worked really hard with our partners to be able to respond to the COVID challenges, and particularly want to highlight the vaccination programme, which I think has been a real success, and also want to recognise Derek as our Director of Public Health, who I think has given our communities real confidence during the pandemic as well. I think he's been proportionate and clearly has built that confidence up. But whilst at the same time as responding to the pandemic challenges, responding to business as usual, the Council has continued to achieve the ambitions of the 10-year plan, and the transformation programme has delivered. And in particular, I cite our transformation around our special educational needs services. We are one of the few local authorities in the country that are not overspending in their higher needs block in terms of supporting children with special educational needs. And we are, again, one of the only local authorities in the country that are seeing step down for children who have been in special schools, have their needs met, and then are able to go back into mainstream school. So I think the transformation that we've done on that has been really positive. The other transformation programme around looking at placements for looked after children is a bit early to begin to yield results yet, but the early findings are promising. We've seen in the early days of pandemic a significant number of children needing to go out of county, unable to be placed with foster carers because foster carers were shielding. Clearly, the decision to bring children back into county and back into in-county foster care is not one that can be taken lightly. You need to make sure that you're not disrupting a child's placement from a home perspective and from an education perspective, and you need to think about the consequences before you move them. But clearly, the plan longer term is that we do transition children back into their local communities and into local provision, which clearly is better for them in terms of maintaining contact with their family networks. And then the other area that we've worked on is across delivering strength-based practice across adult social care, but I won't steal Glenn's thunder. I'll let him share that when you come to his section. And obviously the other transformation programme to highlight is clearly Smarter Working. I know that the committee had a session on that at the last committee meeting. Obviously Smarter Working has now been launched because we are able to, with restrictions, with level B restrictions lifted, we're now able to come back into the offices, and certainly we are beginning to see people come back into the offices. The car park is certainly much busier this week, and certainly I've been up in the leadership hub yesterday and today, and it's much busier, and great to see people back in the offices and been able to have some social face-to-face contacts. So just really very briefly to cover some of the sort of risks area. So the critical risk areas are clearly safeguarding children and adults. Those risks went up. They were red rated the year before last. They're now back to amber, and that's because the restrictions on home visiting and the increased visibility of children through going to school has now returned. So we felt that we were able to readjust that risk back to where it was. Clearly, business continuity and resilience. Again, we're feeling positive around that. Staff are beginning to come back into the offices, and we have tested our business continuity plans, I think, to the limit over the last year, and have been successful in how we've managed to work across the whole of the partnership, supporting our vulnerable communities across the whole of the county. An area, though, of concern and remains of concern is around market supply, and that links to the workforce challenges. We and many of our contracted services are struggling with recruitment of staff. It's not per se everywhere, but it certainly is in particular sectors. The adult care sector, the transport sector, the children's social care sector, those IT skills and commercial skills. And what we're seeing is a challenge with retention. People can now command much higher salaries elsewhere. IMT, you can work from home and yet work for an American-based company in the new world and command a much greater salary. In terms of the adult care market, we're seeing competition with Amazon and the hospitality sector, and we all know, looking at the media around Amazon, can clearly pay much greater salaries. So whilst there is work being done, we have set up as well an LCC workforce development board to look at how we can mitigate some of those challenges. But I think workforce and market supply are linked together in terms of our biggest challenge moving forward as we go through this year. I've obviously mentioned projects in the transformation programme, and just, you know, clearly many of our transformation programmes are now coming to effect, which has been really positive. Next year, though, sees the start of our transformation on our home to school contracts. We're seeing spiralling costs on our home to school transport, our home to school contracts, clearly concerns around market management, and so we have got a transformation project around the home to school contracts, and Andy may wish to cover that in his section as well. But budget-wise, clearly the pandemic has placed extra strain on our budgets, but we have received about over £100 million from the government, who have supported us with COVID challenges. That additional income has met the response to the pandemic, but clearly we remain anxious about those children who are looked after and placed out of county because of the pandemic, in terms of the length of time that it's going to take to turn that around. And therefore, the proposal for the budget in February is that we do utilise some of our reserves to bolster that and to address that in the short term while we do some more mitigations. And then finally, and I'll pause then, is to highlight the issue around cybercrime and information governance. Again, James will talk about this in a bit more detail when we come on to his section. Clearly, the need to be vigilant and at an individual level, and for staff to be trained in cyber attacks and information governance is critical. And the other area of criticality is our unsupported systems. So we have a number of unsupported systems that were created years and years and years ago, and we need to shift them to supported off-the-shelf systems, but clearly that takes a considerable amount of time. And just to give some assurance to the committee, the Overview and Scrutiny Management Committee have asked for oversight of those projects that are, of those systems that are unsupported, so that they can provide some additional governance as we move forward onto that. So I'll pause at that point and see if there's any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. If I can move around everyone for questions for Debbie, if that's okay, and then we'll move on to Glenn. Peter.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, Debbie, I think, you know, we all know your skills in bringing a sound adult and child service to the county. That's well known, well published, and you should take a lot of credit for that. Now, I know you're working with the unitaries to the north, or one of them, on trying to improve their levels. That won't be to the negative effect of the rest of Lincolnshire and the services you're providing. It may be a simple question, but I don't know whether it's for you or Glenn, because I wouldn't want to see our services drop one iota. So just a quick answer for that, please.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for your very kind comments around children's and adult services. So Lincolnshire is, for children's services, what's called by the Department of Education a partner in practice, and so we're funded separately through a ring-fence grant through the government to provide support to other areas. So you'll know that we worked in Rotherham, we've worked in Tower Hamlets, we're currently working in Northamptonshire, and clearly we're in discussions about working with North East Lincolnshire. That's not been finalised at all yet, we're just in discussions around that. And so we have, through that journey of working with other local authorities, built up skills and expertise and capacity that is funded from outside of Lincolnshire to be able to support those other children's services. So in relation to children's services, I think we've got a track record of it demonstrating that it's not had a negative effect because it is funded separately. More recently, the most recent initiative is clearly to look at integrating and having a shared approach to public health. And I'm aware that a paper went to adult scrutiny recently and to exec yesterday around entering into a section 113 around a shared public health service. Derek, obviously as our Director of Public Health, has been in very frequent discussions, myself and Glenn, and his professional advice to us is that he does believe strongly that there is the capacity and skills within the system to be able to provide a shared response. And he feels that actually it would bring many benefits to North, North East and Lincolnshire in terms of addressing health inequalities. Now, clearly we're going to do that as a pilot. We need to evaluate it at 6 months, at 12 months, and then at 18 months before we make any decisions, because absolutely, like you and I'm sure everybody in this council, we would not want anything to dilute the really strong public health responses that we've had. North and North East Lincolnshire have got significant cover at a consultant level, so underneath the director level, and so Derek feels that actually through their strong consultant model, he will have capacity to be able to lead across that whole of that geography. But just to assure you, we are only doing it as a pilot and can stop it at any point in time, albeit there are built-in evaluations at 6, 12 and then 18 months.
Thank you. It was very useful to have the presentation on smarter working. And I think any notions that when COVID is over, if it ever is, we just go back to exactly what we did before, I don't think that's tenable. One reads in the business pages of London finance firms downsizing to about half of what they were before, etc. And what was good about the presentation we had was that, and it's very early days, you don't have much data yet, but the metrics are not telling you it's a horror story in terms of the hard metrics of attendance and productivity and so on. But whoever presented, sorry I've forgotten his name, he was very cautious. He said, there are the long-term ones. What about people's perception of career progression, things of that nature? What about the softer skills of how you build team ethos and so on? And that's going to take a lot of evaluation. But point one is I would wish that we get another look at that issue when there is some meaningful progress. I think it's very imaginative of you to bring it to an audit committee that looks at Michelle's accounts, for instance. You know, we do a lot more than that because we're interested in controls and systems over the key resources, and the local authorities, key resources people, isn't it? And therefore, yes, bring it back to us. And I wondered if you've got any further observations of, have you learned something you didn't expect to learn about smarter working that is going to change the whole perception of employment contracts and employment practices?
Great, thank you very much, and I'm really pleased that you found the presentation helpful. I think it might have been Andrew McLean or Lee Surdyfield that done the presentation. I think the challenge that we've got in terms of any further observations, I'm more than happy to bring back another presentation to the committee. It would be really helpful to have your challenge and your perceptions to the data. In reality, Smarter Working actually launched 2 weeks ago, because up until then we've been working under level B restrictions, which were work from home because of the global pandemic. And so I've been very clear in my communications to staff, because almost staff have said we're now working under Smarter Working. No, we're not working under Smarter Working. We're working under a global pandemic under level B restrictions, and they only were lifted 2 weeks ago. So actually it's only 2 weeks that we have been working under a Smarter Working feel. As I said, it's very early days. The car park is, though, looking fuller. It is without a doubt. And I am sort of personally seeing more people around. My sense, and it's only a sense, isn't it, because I haven't got any data at the moment, my sense is that people are enjoying seeing each other, and they're bound to be, after being, locked down for sort of 2 years off and on. People are bound to get a bit of a buzz around that sort of social interaction. We've had some very, very, very early data for the first week. which is looking at about a sort of, a 40% booking of desks, but then sort of 20% of them not attending. Now, how much of it is they're not attending or they're not actually buzzing in to log into the desk is more work that I think we need to do. But I'm expecting the return to the offices to be a slow burn, if I'm honest with you, as people gain their confidence.
Thank you. If I may, I forgot my second question, which was, I've long been an advocate, given that we're looking at long-term staffing challenges, of much bigger apprenticeship programs. And I think not only is that a self-interest issue of you grow your own, but also when you're one of the largest employers in an area, particularly a relatively rural area, there's almost a duty, an economic and social regeneration duty to contribute as one of the biggest employers. Have you increased apprenticeship programs significantly, or is there more scope to do that? And is there a policy decision that needs to be made by the council to become a big apprentice developer?
Yeah, thank you. So within the aspirations of the corporate plan, there is a corporate strategic performance target about apprenticeships and a commitment to increase the number of apprenticeships. So absolutely, that's part of what we are measured by the executive on a quarterly basis. There is much more that we can do. We are not spending all of our apprenticeship levy on apprenticeship training. So without a doubt, there is a current gap in relation to that. I think there's a few challenges with it. So one challenge is clearly that the 20% off the job is a challenge, because with apprenticeships, the way that it's currently arranged is that you pay somebody, but they're only with you 80% of the time. So 20% of the time they're elsewhere, they're not on the job, which is, I think, a challenge. The availability of apprenticeship programs for all of our much needed skills are not always accessible. They are now coming online. It's taken time, obviously, for the market to switch to be able to make those apprenticeships available. But absolutely, without doubt, we can do more, and the proposal is that we do more in terms of apprenticeship. I mean, I think it's really timely because it's obviously Apprenticeship Week this week. We do a big business support apprenticeships, and I talk to them during Apprenticeship Week every year, and it's always a real pleasure to see such innovation and excitement and motivation from that group. Absolutely, yes, it is something. Yes, we can do more. I think if we had more freedom and flexibility at a local level, which if we were to be successful on devolution, then clearly we would be asking for more permissions locally to design apprenticeship programs to suit our needs, because the current nationally designed program is quite difficult to manoeuvre and difficult to flex. It's not the easiest system to work with.
I have a question for Derek. But first of all, I have other questions on the report. Are we going to deal with those on a topic-by-topic basis as we get into the detail? That's fine. The question is a sort of follow-up one on smarter working and working from home. And I was interested in your comment about your staff not understanding the difference, perhaps, between working from home and smarter working. Is it entirely clear to them what that difference is? And is it entirely clear to them then what the consequences might be in terms of moving away from a working from home under pandemic Plan B restrictions to the more formalised, if I can put it that way, smarter working? Are there things that will be taking place differently, shall I say, from the Plan B working from home regime into the smarter working one, even if those need to be developed over a period of time so that people do understand what those differences are? And I was thinking in particular about meetings and things like that, because when I was working in London many years ago, we did have smarter working then. That was at Westminster City Council, and they were a forerunner of it. It was all to save money in Westminster's case, I think. it did work reasonably well because at that time we didn't have Zoom and Teams, so meetings had to take place at headquarters. And if you went into the office for the meeting, you know, you stayed there and did the normal sort of things that you do in an office environment, you know, including talking to your staff and doing your human resources type roles and all those sorts of things, and you know, even the junior staff, you know, in terms of, you know, ensuring they were happy and they were understanding what they were doing and all those sort of things. So I just wondered if there is sort of significances between the working from home and the smarter working ones that need to be brought into play and explained so that people do understand what that difference is. And that might overcome some of the concerns that have been raised, I suppose, in terms of, you know, what does it actually mean from our perspective in terms of, you know, the whole process and the productivity issues and all those sorts of things.
Thank you. So there's two elements to the question. The first one clearly is the difference in terms of the lockdown restrictions is that if you could work from home, you must work from home. And clearly smarter working is that we want you to work in a hybrid way and have a presence in the office as well as working from home, flexing what you're doing. So the emphasis is very clear in my mind. You must work from home if you can, and actually we want you to work in a hybrid way. I think what's more important is the subtleties across the whole of the organisation. So the council is a collection of some really complex services that some people may argue you wouldn't naturally put together. And our fire and rescue service have not been virtually putting out fires. Our fire and rescue services have been out and working face to face and have not been working from home. Our social workers have been out and doing face-to-face visits. Our hospital teams have been out and working face-to-face. Our highways have been out all the way through the pandemic, working out there. So in terms of do our workforce understand, swathes of our work staff have not been working from home. They've continued to work in the way that they always have because they're community staff. And we need to make sure that we've got more opportunities for them to be even more flexible in terms of where they work, be it that they want to pop into a cafe and upload stuff onto a system or whatever. Now, clearly, I think the group of staff that it's most impacted upon in terms of the difference are clearly what we would call probably back office staff, those staff that are traditionally based on this campus. So the policy is very clear that actually the policy is modelled on 2 days a week, but it is for that you would be in the office and 3 days a week that you wouldn't, but clearly there's flexibility within that. And the process and the mechanism is that you engage with your manager and your manager agrees your work pattern with you. We've had lots of discussions as a corporate leadership team. We feel that managers know their teams best, managers know their expectations of their teams best. Clearly we're paying our managers to manage and therefore we need our managers to manage within the parameters of the smarter working policy. No, I don't think we're going to get it right 100% first time. I think the first year will be a learning year. I think some people will have different perceptions, and I think we'll learn together with our workforce about what it looks like in pretty much the same way as we had to learn what it looks like when we first started working from home under smarter working. So I think we're going to have a much richer understanding in about 6 months' time around what it looks like, and then I'm sure we'll be sitting down with staff and with the unions to review the policy as well.
So 6 months might be a good time to have another discussion about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you, Mark. Before I bring Peter in, second question. Anybody else? Do we know? No. Yeah, Peter. So.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, Debbie, because we're using the word smarter, we've got to end up smarter, haven't we? We've got to do that, whether it be 3 months, 6 months or 9 months. I don't mind where staff work, but in all businesses we should look for efficiencies, productivity, communications. Otherwise you've got no business at all. So efficiencies, not inefficiencies, and productivity, not tomorrow will do, and communications, not isolation. And that's the worst one, I think. working from home is that isolation. So, I feel that you're getting plans together, but you've probably got quite a lot more work to do. We're a business. We've got to make ends meet. No different to any little two-man gang in a little commercial unit somewhere trying to make ends meet. We're just the same, but we've got a bigger job. Or the officers have got a bigger job to put that together. So I assume your plans are coming together, and as Mark just mentioned, probably 6 months time would be a good time to see how that's grown. It's good to see people back at work, but probably they've come to work for a holiday because they're not at home. It's a holiday. It's something different because they've been at home for so long. You know, it's a real good change, like a holiday is. So yeah, you know, you've got to crack on with it, but we need to get it right.
So I think, I mean, just to say that, that all of our evidence in terms of our cost base, in terms of our performance information, in terms of our productivity, rates incredibly well across other councils. We're certainly a top performing council. And I think that that is absolutely credit to the hard work, dedication and commitment of our staff without a shadow of a doubt. If anything, I think that the feedback is that we've got a long hours culture and the staff work incredibly long hours and work incredibly hard, no matter where they are. I think the point around productivity is really important. And again, if I just look back at myself, I look at my diary. So Friday, for example, I've got a regional chief execs meeting. First off, then I've got a meeting with health, and then I've got some interviews taking place later on in the afternoon. That would be 3 days worth of work in the old way of travelling to all of the different meetings. It wouldn't be 1 day's worth of work, it would be 3 days worth of work. And so I think in terms of less travel, clearly has, for me and for all of my colleagues, been incredibly much more productive because you're not spending 2 or 3 hours in a car. And that's certainly the feedback that we're getting. That's where we're making loads more efficiencies in terms of the budget. So the budget has been reduced from a revenue perspective due to travel by £1 million next year. Because of smarter working, and that doesn't include any sort of capital release costs. So in terms of efficiency and productivity, the early indications are really positive. Absolutely agree with you around communication. Our staff are our most treasured resource that we absolutely need to make sure that we communicate with. Again, over the pandemic, I've been doing monthly staff sessions, and at each session, I can touch 300 people. I couldn't do that before. I couldn't physically get 300 people in a room to touch and to communicate with. And yet through smarter working, I can spend 1 day having 4 briefings and meet 1,000 staff, which I just would never have been able to have the possibility to do pre-COVID. And we can do more of that to make sure that we have better engagement with our staff moving forward. Absolutely, completely agree.
Debbie, just go back to the example. In your case, certainly having, half a dozen or a dozen chief executives, going around the country to get together for a meeting might not be appropriate. And there might be far better ways of doing it now that we've got the ability to do so. And similarly, talking to 300 or 400 people is quite difficult. But there are good times or good purposes behind some face-to-face meetings. And really that's what I was referring to earlier on to a certain extent. It's making the best use of the facilities that we've got and the processes that we've got. Certainly, I mean, having, a face-to-face team meeting, for a manager with a dozen staff or whatever it is, every so often is probably quite a good thing for him and for the staff. Because I do think you miss some things out. You do gain obviously some things, and you can actually cope with it in a particular circumstance. And certainly it's probably entirely appropriate for chief executives to operate in that sort of way. But for a manager who's responsible for the day-to-day management of his staff, and particularly making sure that they are happy and have got well-being and understanding of what is happening and can bring issues up. I think the face-to-face meetings, it really has to be a match, and it is different, I think, as you go through the organisation at different levels as well.
Absolutely. The current policy and certainly all of our communications have been encouraging that frequently managers have supervisions and team meetings face to face. Absolutely, couldn't agree with you more. You know, those work sessions are really important, and maybe you don't need every single one, but you certainly do need some to have face to face. Couldn't agree more.
Thank you. Just one question before we move on to Glenn, because I know we've said we're going to talk to Glenn following yourself. On the children's services side, Debbie, obviously there's been a lot of children that potentially may have sort of missed the radar, so to speak, in COVID. Have we got plans in place to make sure that those are brought back into the education system and tracks, particularly on not on an education issue, but on a safeguarding one as well?
Yes, thank you. So we were, again, one of the few local authorities that what we would say rag-rated our families in the beginning of the pandemic, and our staff did go out with PPE to continue to see those families. We worked really closely with the schools as well, and again, our schools have just responded brilliantly to work in collaboration with us to make sure that either we or they had eyes on children as much as possible. We are seeing an increase in the number of children who are chosen by their parents to be electively home educated. That clearly is a concern. Obviously, we do frequent visits to those that are electively home educated. So I think it would be fair to say that working in collaboration with the schools and with what we know and with our partners, and clearly it's helpful that health visiting is insourced and delivered by the council, because then obviously we've then able to share that intelligence much more effectively. But you don't know what you don't know, and the danger is always on those children that you haven't had eyes on or that nobody has eyes on. And obviously we've seen the two very high profile tragic deaths, of which clearly one wasn't at school and therefore people didn't have eyes on. And so, you know, you can never say never, but, you know, I think our relationships are really good with our schools to try and make sure we have as eyes on as many of those vulnerable families as we possibly can, albeit you don't know what you don't know.
Yes, thank you. Just a very quick one, and I appreciate there is a difference between working at home and smart working, but clearly when people are on smart working based at home, that they sometimes use out of office hours, and I know that in other councils that I represent, there has been some concern about being able to contact officials during the working day when they are opting to work either early morning or late evening. True, you can do it by email, but sometimes you wish to have the phone conversation, and I wonder if that's being looked into or advice has been given on that.
Absolutely can assure you advice has been given. We're very clear on our staff briefings that your hours of work are agreed and negotiated with your manager, and that, because again, with a number of questions have come up where people have asked that very question, and I've been critical clear that if people feel that they want to change the core hours of their services, they need to demonstrate how that best meets the needs of their communities and the people that we are here to serve. That's the bottom line. We are here to serve our communities, and it may be that there is a valid argument that people come home from school and actually would rather make calls to people between 4 and 6, and it may be that they've got evidence base around that. If there are examples where you're trying to contact staff and you are not getting a response, then please escalate it to either myself, any of the exec directors. Once we know about things, we can do something about it. So absolutely, people have been given clear advice, and the clear direction is that people should be accessible. You know, so any issues, then please escalate.
Thank you, Councillor Rawlings, and it's very nice to see you again. So members will have had the report from myself as part of the overall assurance report. I'm going to draw out a few points, if I may, and then take questions. Any virus exposes the weaknesses in a system, whether it's a human system or whether it's an organisational one. And COVID is no particularly different in that regard. The two key weaknesses in Lincolnshire have been our hospital systems and the fragility of social care markets. What's interesting is that those weaknesses weren't particularly highlighted in the first 18 months of the pandemic. A lot of councils, a lot of systems in the country struggled substantially in waves 1, 2 and 3. We did not, and I think that's largely because of what we had in place prior to the pandemic in terms of working relationships, investments in innovative forms of service provision, and probably one of the strongest structural arrangements with market providers anywhere in the country, given that we have a very close working relationship with those providers through the Linker umbrella body. That's the Lincolnshire Care Association umbrella body. Having said that, the last few weeks of the winter period has been one in which the numbers are starting to go in the right direction, particularly around people waiting on discharge, waiting for care, and also in terms of community nursing service, because a lot of the pinch points have been within the clinical grades, both at the hospital and in the community. I think we are facing a new normal, and yet probably will not understand what that looks like until 2023, 2024. The last 2 years' worth of data are not something upon which to build a trend line. There are substantial variations, and I suspect a number of them will be sustained over the period. I think it's also important to bear in mind that we have a very busy government with the Health and Social Care Bill, Social Care Reform White Paper, Integration White Paper, which has been published today, and the Mental Health Act reforms, along with a new autism strategy. And that's only the initial list. All of those collectively represent a profound shift in the nature of the services that I'm responsible for, not just social care, but public health as well. So we will have to be very busy this year preparing for the implications of those government publications, not least the Social Care Reform White Paper, because in 2023 they begin to have material impacts on not just what we do, but how we choose to operate. A number of those documents have already been presented to both scrutiny and to informal executive, and our best guess on their implications for us as a council and as a system. Debbie's already highlighted the improvement programme that is halfway through the programme, a long-term programme, because it's about behavioural change, and that allows me to emphasise the importance. It's not just what you choose to provide in terms of services, it's how the professionals in those services choose to behave. We already know, and there's very good international research, the level of over-prescribing in the NHS is at about a quarter, 25% over-prescribing rates, and it's not just for pharmacology. There's also a level of over-prescribing in social care. The improvement programme that we're working on is trying to address that level of over-prescribing by building on people's strengths, hence strengths-based practice, improving their resilience because they can find other solutions to many of their issues without resorting to publicly funded care or NHS provision. The priorities that we've got at the moment: digital, housing, which is unusual for a two-tier area because it's not part of the legislative brief that an upper-tier authority has, strengths-based practice, and integration, all of which place the council in a really good position not just to be well placed to respond to new legislative programmes, but also to increase our ability to meet what is an increasingly complex array of service needs in the population we're serving. Some of that has been driven by COVID, because both in health and social care, we are seeing higher levels of acuity and more complex needs as a result. My final observation for members of this committee is that it isn't just about dealing with the here and now. It's about recognising that the tail of the COVID pandemic is going to be long and is going to be in itself a work of effort. We hear often government and NHS colleagues talk about the backlog in the NHS, which will take many years to resolve, for which there is 5.6 billion allocated for the next 3 years. In social care, there is also a tail of COVID that has a less strong national narrative, but is no less profound in terms of better meeting people's needs. Happy to take questions, Chair.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm very pleased to hear you say that Lincolnshire is well positioned to deal with all the issues that you've raised. I hope that is the case. However, there is a whole raft of issues that existed before COVID. There's a whole raft of issues that will exist after COVID that are even greater, no doubt. The issues associated with COVID itself, hopefully, will not be that severe, or may be overtaken then by how we just deal with health and social and adult care in the future. But there is a raft of legislation coming out. And bearing in mind that we had issues before COVID, I take it that the legislation that's coming out will all have a cost associated with it if it's going to be delivered in a way that does actually improve the lot of the population of Lincolnshire. Have you actually done any work to work out what those sort of costs may will be to react to the legislation? So that you know whether, in fact, you can deliver these goods with the systems and processes that we've got in place in Lincolnshire, or whether we need ones and new resources, and there is costs associated with that, which we can either fund or we can't fund, and then have to get the funds from somewhere else.
Thank you, Chair. The Social Care Reform White Paper is the one at the moment that probably has the most significant cost implications for this council. The Prime Minister's statement in Parliament in September, the Chancellor's in November, the budget reports in December, all talk to the implications on social care of charging reform and what the government describes as fair rates of care. In terms of price differentials between what people pay privately for social care, which is about 50% of the market in Lincolnshire, and what people pay because they are receiving state-funded care through my area. The recent informal executive meetings just before Christmas received a report on our best estimates of what that would mean for us. The social care reform document, I think, if I'm to summarise it, talks mostly to charging reforms, and that is where the majority of the money will go. So that 5.4 billion will go on three things: raising the minimum threshold after which people pay for care or pay a contribution from 14 to 20,000, creating a cap on personal care at 86,000, and also providing a fair rates, which is to close the differential between public and private. Most of that 5.4 billion will go on that. I'm responsible for half of the market in Lincolnshire that white paper does not talk to. And that's where the council tax comes in. And that is something that's above my batting average, Chair, and is down to both the executive and full council in the coming weeks. But it is the council tax, essentially, that closes the gap on the pressures that I face in publicly funded social care in terms of people who do not have the wherewithal to pay privately. The other thing to bear in mind, and this is just a small example, in the future, the council will be responsible for managing about 20,000 care accounts each year from October 2023. At the moment, we manage about 10,000. The doubling is the direct consequence of some of the reforms that the government have outlined. So you'll begin to see the scale of the change that we are going to be responsible for.
Can I come back? Well, to a certain extent, I think that's what I was getting at. You know, that we may well have been operating in a reasonable way in the past. It's whether we can continue to operate in a reasonable way in the future, and indeed, you know, improve the way that we operate. Because the demographics of the country means that there's going to be more and more people. Never mind the straightforward split between private and public. There's going to be more and more people that fall into the adult care arena. So it does strike me that the demands are going to be greater and greater as time goes on. We have to know how we're going to react and know what the cost of that reaction is, and indeed, you know, where the funds are going to come from, because, you know, at the end of the day, you know, there's only so far you can go with taxation, I think, whether it's council tax or income tax or national insurance tax or whatever.
Thank you, Chair. If I may, Chair, reasonable isn't good enough. And I doubt that the Chief Exec would expect me to be reasonable in my aspirations for my area of service. We are already working on a number of programmes which will place the council in as good a footing as we can, both within finance and in my own area, to be, as it were, able to respond to the new legislative reforms. I should also mention, though, and this is something that we've been working on within the corporate team, digital programmes. The council must, as it were, progress its digital programme in order for us to be well placed for future reforms, not least in terms of charging, but in other areas particularly pertinent to my area of responsibility. We are already working on a number of those, and we will be dependent. Indeed, one of the key elements of our future is the level of interdependency that we will have, not just within the council, across different areas of service, but also with our key partners externally. If we don't start to talk systems in the future, we will singularly fail to meet needs as well as we would wish.
I think we had one of those at a recent meeting of the Lincolnshire Health Scrutiny Committee, one of the digital platforms that's been developed. I wish you well with all those.
Yeah. Sorry, thank you, Glenn. I've always thought child and adult care is a bit A&E. You never know what's going to hit you tomorrow. And I don't know as I'd want to be in that sort of job. But I think going forward, you know, you say we're going to have COVID problems or related as going down the road from various angles. I wish you well. I don't want your job. Thank you.
Well, I was going to say something very similar. I do not envy Mr. Garrett, his portfolio, and I'm going to make life even harder for him to remind him that we got excited at a previous meeting when we had the financial control team telling us about the bad debt, and indirectly you're responsible for much of it. And the hypothesis there was that imaginative, flexible use of fast-track packages and things of that nature, which possibly went back to people doing the assessments and whether they're done in a timely fashion, etc. And we know what a tremendously family pressure there is, you know, when a loved one is near death, etc., etc. Not easy at all, but when more than half of the council's debt is linked to adult social care, we needed to get excited. So if you like to update us on that, whether or not there's been any retraining or re-guidance of people who are involved in that early stage of determining adult social care packages. And the second one, of course, is you've referred a couple of times, as has Debbie, about working closer with partners. And of course, we've got an integrated care system coming along, which let's hope it's not just a set of words that the government's thought up, that it actually means something. So given that we as a nation, either through local authority social care or through the NHS, have got a massive challenge if we're going to do right by our populations. And I take your point, Glenn, you can say 5 million, etc. It's not nearly enough. I don't think this nation spends enough on its keeping people well and alive and so on. But that's above all our pay grades. And I can quote to you the figures from Derbyshire from only last week: 1,000 fewer carers than there were last July. And Derbyshire's not that much bigger than Lincolnshire, and 300 of the 1,800 beds blocked in the 2 Derbyshire hospitals because people can't be discharged because they can't get the care packages in place. 15% of the beds lost. Complete waste of resource. Where do we fare in that scenario with ULHT? And is it social work packages that's the problem there? And how's that going to work better in the future?
Thank you, Chair. So in terms of the debt review programme, I believe we, every month, have made substantial progress on the work that we began before the audit was undertaken. And I should say that, if you like, in my experience, one can discover a problem for oneself. What that usually does is it presents a worse picture than you were previously reporting at a corporate level. And then you can start to make progress. So you get a reality check, which is often worse than the report that you would have previously seen. And that's the timing of the audit report. So what was going before was being reported at this level. We had done work to uncover our own issues some 2-3 years ago, which presented a different level, which was higher, over 23 million. The Directorate, I think, over the last few months, last year or so, with finance colleagues, has strengthened the existing recovery programme. We've improved the relationships with operational teams. One of the challenges that we faced was that we had finance, Serco, and my area all playing out on something which was essentially transactional. That was a fundamental flaw in thinking, for which I'm partly responsible for. We weren't looking at the customer. Now that becomes really important when you think about what's coming down the track through the Social Care Reform White Paper, because there'll be 20,000 care accounts. We've got to look at the customer, not just as at a transaction, which of course was pretty much what we were expecting Serco to manage, a bunch of transactions. So that's been massively changed. The performance reporting which Serco was given was set aside over 2 years ago because it wasn't telling us what we needed to know in better managing finances and debt. So we have every month improved performance on debt. We have now, ahead of schedule, completed all debt owing over £25,000. We will complete by the 31st of March all debt owing over £15,000. Having said all of that, when I was in Hampshire, about 12 years ago now, I was, as part of other responsibilities, also responsible for debt management within the council. You should expect an average for a county of this size of between 8 to 9 million ongoing debt. So that's the kind of target that we should be looking at. We're not far from that now. We've also had other problems which are outside of our control. So the Court of Protection has a huge backlog nationally. Court of Protection is a national offer by the Officer of the Public Guardian, and that accounts for about £750,000 of our debt. We have listed it as a risk, but it is beyond our control to manage. In addition, some of the debt that we were logging shouldn't have been in there in the first place, because there were debts of about £1 on an account. Whilst that doesn't affect the total, it does, as it were, mean that we're now better able to target the more risky debts, the higher levels of debt, but also prepare ourselves better for 2023. I should also mention that we had 2 Ombudsmen reports which found fault against the council. For over 15 years, the council had been running a system of payments to the residential market, which effectively saved the council £800,000 a year, because providers were collecting debt on our behalf. What the Ombudsman said was he didn't think that was appropriate, and to be fair to him, he was ahead of the time in saying, well, if you don't change to a system of collecting debt yourself, you won't be in a good position to prepare yourself for the white paper in 2023. So we're also moving from a system of net payment to providers to a system of gross payment. That places us really well with the white paper agenda. So a whole raft of new elements coming into play. I think we're really strong on this, and I'd rather hope that Lucy, when her team come and visit us again, will be able to reflect on that for you. If I may, Chair, the point about ICS and bed blockages, I'm very aware that some members of this committee have other hats. One of the questions you might ask is, in terms of delayed discharges, there are 4 pathways. Pathway 0, you don't need anything on discharge, you get yourself home and you sort yourself out. Pathway 1, you might need a bit of community nursing or home care. Pathway 2 might be residential for a short stay or reablement. Pathway 3, you need long stay residential. Okay, the question to ask is, how are we performing on pathway 1 and 0? Pathway 0 is all about the level of risk that the hospital and clinical grades are prepared to accept in discharging people from the hospital. If you're operating at about 85%, that's pretty good. That's the regional average. If you're operating at 70%, you have to ask questions, because if you're not operating at the regional average, you are creating problems in pathway 1, 2, and 3. It's a pyramid. If you ask that question, you will find that in the local system, pathway 0 is operating at about 70%, which puts pressure on pathway 1, 2, and 3. That was picked up just before Christmas. That is something that our NHS colleagues are working on to get to the regional average. Pathway 1, we had a peer review back end of last year, an independent peer review of discharge to assess. And there are 7 core actions that I've been working on with my CCG colleagues. We meet every fortnight to track that progress. There's a system improvement director leading that, and some of those elements have got investment behind them. I would expect that by March, April, not only will we be saying we've got that into a really good place, but we'll be stronger as in consequence for winter 23-24. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Glenn. If I could just ask you a couple of questions, Glenn. I do apologise, I'm getting my technology around my neck, not unusual. In terms of obviously the gross payment system is could be a big financial risk for us. So although we're going to be compliant with government directives, it doesn't exactly help us on the financial end. We need to obviously you liaise with Michelle's team to have some robust systems there to make sure we minimise that debt as much as possible. And in terms of the I was intrigued to hear what you said about the over-prescribing. Obviously, this has been recently on the news headlines on the NHS. But in terms of can we minimise that with more integrated working with public health? Presumably we can. And also, is there a little bit of demand management there, Glenn? Because, again, some people can be encouraged to do some self-help items as well. They don't always need the social services to intervene. If they could be, like you said, sort of directed into something that would help them, that may be a lot more cost effective than our intervention or that of the health service.
Thank you, Chair. A number of questions there. The net to gross before Christmas, we had written to all the providers in the county, social care providers who were, as it were, managing the debt on behalf of the council, because we weren't doing gross, we were doing net payments. We've had now over 80% of the market providers respond to us. That gives us the vast majority of outstanding debt that they are holding that would otherwise transfer to the council when we start to move to gross payments. I should say that the level of debt outstanding is minimal. It's hundreds of thousands, not millions, which gives us a high level of assurance that, as it were, we are not taking on a massive debt burden by moving from net to gross, because the providers aren't holding on to that at the moment. And I think one of the structural reasons for that is that 74% of the market in Lincolnshire is small to medium providers. You can't hold a high level of debt as a small to medium enterprise because you won't be there for very long if you are. Yeah. Bigger providers, which other systems have, tend to hold on to a higher level of debt. So in a way, there's a structural benefit for Lincolnshire having a very high ratio of smaller providers. So we've done that work. And it gives us a level of assurance about, as it were, our preparedness. But we are critically dependent on the implementation of a number of digital programs that will help us manage that without having to create an army of people to do, as it were, a very labour-intensive item.
Just to come in on that, so before we go any further, like on a practical level, do then the county council, if you have some digital interaction with a pension service, for instance, could you get the payment made directly to us from the pension service rather than going into the... I mean, you can't, presumably that's not going to happen because that wouldn't be gross payment either, but there's lots of opportunities for people to, the finances, if you like, to fall through the cracks.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, the DWP have changed their approach, and we've got a working relationship and also an agreement to share data. It isn't at the individual level, though, because that's a confidential item. Yeah. But we are able increasingly to share data with the DWP, and the new investment in IT will, as it were, facilitate that.
So, for instance, a pensioner would have to be able to prove to you actually what their level of pension was.
Thank you, Chair. Yes. As part of the system improvements on financial assessments, we looked at what we were expecting people to tell us about not just their income but also their savings. Yeah. We realised that, frankly, we were over-egging it in terms of what we were asking people to tell us, which had introduced delays that were unnecessary in then coming up with a good understanding of what people owed. So we've refreshed the documentation. It's moving to an online system. It's a lot slicker. We've moved from 17 weeks on average down to 4. So a number of system improvements, as well as a higher level of expectation around what digital can offer. In terms of the integration with health and over-prescribing, we've recently agreed with the 4 NHS organisations that employ occupational therapists, along with our own, to reorganise those occupational therapists to work collectively. One of the highest levels of overprescription in the NHS is equipment on discharge by our hospital OT. Yeah. And that's very clearly evidenced. By moving them to a closer arrangement with community OTs, the level of overprescription has reduced massively. Now, that makes a real difference on the pooled budget for joint equipment of hundreds of thousands of pounds. So that's just an example of where we're trying to intervene to reduce overprescription. And it has to be said that community practitioners tend to be, as it were, they tend to have a better risk threshold in what people can do than those in, as we say, institutional settings.
I think we
And if I might, Chair, you gave me an opportunity to talk about prevention.
Yeah.
We're one of the few councils in the country that invests heavily in preventative services. Debbie rightly commended public health services for what they've been doing over the last 2 years. It's not just Derek, of course. Derek's business model was created some 5 years ago, and Derek has a much broader remit than many of his counterparts in the country. There's essentially 2 business models for public health in the country. One is essentially what was lifted and shifted from the NHS back in 2013, which is a very clinical offer. The other says, you've got more to give. So nearly a third of what I'm responsible for sits with Derek as part of his preventative offer. Derek leads on housing. Derek leads on digital. Derek leads on carer support and wellbeing in Lincolnshire, which is something that we hope our northern counterparts will benefit from, because the business model in Lincolnshire, I think, if it were ever to be inspected, would stand out rather well. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And one very quick final point. How are we coping on market supply with the fact that potentially we've lost quite a lot of adult social care staff because of the vaccination issue?
Thank you, Chair. Just before Christmas, a conversation with the Home Office went very well, and we now have permission from the Home Office to look at people receiving an income of under 30,000, which was previously a limitation. And of course, care workers tend not to earn over £30,000 a year. The Home Office has now allowed us to do that, and we're able to start recruiting people from countries in the European community where previously we were barred because of Home Office regulations. That's making a difference. In Lincolnshire, I need about 230 home care workers to be on top of the demand that we have. Going into Europe should give us a fighting chance of re-recruiting people that we lost over the last 2 years, not just as a result of COVID. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you. Okay, are we all, any further questions for Glenn? It was a very comprehensive look at your service, Glenn, and as always, very interesting. So thank you very much. Okay, thank you. Andrew. Michelle. Oh, I say who's going to put the hand up first? Michelle, I'll hand over to you.
Yes, I will be disguised as Andrew for today. So Andrew sends his apologies. Unfortunately, the change of the date.
I was looking at Andy.
Oh, sorry.
No, Michelle, go first.
Would you like an Andrew or would you like an Andy?
No, we'll go Michelle. You've got your hand up. So I know Andrew isn't here. He's got double booked. So.
Yeah, so unfortunately Andrew couldn't make it this morning. He sends his apologies. So we'll just pick up on the resources area of the combined assurance report. So the resources area has a wide range of functions, including support functions, but also the front-facing functions in terms of public protection and emergency planning. So the report picks up the key pieces of work and highlights from each of those services, which hopefully you've had a chance to look through. I think a key theme running through some of these is around the workforce, and we've obviously picked up on that already about some areas of challenge around workforce in delivering our services, and the people strategies mentioned in the resources area as a highlighted area where we're looking to prioritise the Lincolnshire County Council recruitment and retention approach. So I think it's probably safe to say that I think our services have responded really well during COVID. some of the key challenges are on there around some of the finance team key challenges. So I think the key challenge has been the overlaying of work created by COVID and the council's transformation programme over our normal business. I'm sure you'll all appreciate that the finance business can be pretty relentless in a normal cycle with accounts, budget setting, monitoring and managing grants. None of that ceased during COVID. And Debbie mentioned the level of grants that we've received from government to support COVID, so 100 million last year with that continuing into this year as well. I think it's safe to say that the government have provided some significant support, particularly in Glenn's and Heather's area. I think it's also safe to say that the government has quite significant reporting requirements and insurance that comes with using that money. So the team have really been focused on trying to ensure that we fully utilise all the money that comes into the county to make sure it's being properly used to support our residents. I think the key challenges that we've picked up on there, we've obviously got the use of the apprenticeship levy. We've already talked about some of the actions that we're taking to help with that. I think it's probably needs to be clear that the apprenticeship levy is used to support people's training and has some quite strict kind of usage around it in terms of the apprenticeship standards. And Debbie's already mentioned about some of the work we're doing to try and overcome and maximise that as much as we can. I think from my own perspective that one of the red risks is around my team. I think just to put in perspective, I've had 5 retirements from our team over the last 12 months and they've taken 180 years of service with them, and it's really difficult to replace that. And especially at a time when we're being asked to do more and more. So again, with the audit team, challenge around recruitment and retention and the challenges that then provides in terms of delivering an audit plan. But we've got a number of mitigations in place which hopefully are set out in the report, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Michelle. Mark.
Thank you, Chairman. It's not really a question, it's furthering my information. We know about the issue about the difficulties in appointing the apprenticeships and perhaps not making as much as we could do of the actual levy that's available. It says there's 294 apprentices. Are these directly on the Lincolnshire County Council employment role, or are these some of these placements within our service providers in any way at all?
Thank you. So I can confirm their hours.
They are hours.
Yeah, so vast majority would be business support. But for example, we do also have apprenticeships in planning, we have apprenticeships in social care, in children's social care, adult social care, early help, etc., etc. We do also gift, what we call gift the levy to our providers. So any of our unspent levy, not all of our unspent levy, but as much as other people want, we gift over to our contractors, our providers, so that they can utilise the funds as well. So it's just another way of us trying to maximise the money in Lincolnshire.
Do you have any idea how many apprentices are with those service providers using the funds that you've gifted over to them?
We'd have that. Natalie would have that, so we can certainly get Natalie to provide that.
Thank you.
I think it's probably worth mentioning I've got a number of apprentices in my team, so they're level 7 apprentices, so they're not what you think of as apprentices, like coming straight from school or whatever. They're members of my team that are undertaking their professional chartered qualification. Just had our first one actually finished her sit for training last week, which was a 3-year apprenticeship programme. So great news that we're actually utilising the levy as much as we can.
So it's a very encompassing term.
Yes. Stephen, thank you.
Thank you. I'm interested in under the legal childcare, where I can understand that recruitment and retention is difficult. You say it's a historic issue. Does that mean that nationally we haven't got enough people trained in that level, so people are moving out from here, or is it that people just aren't attracted?
I'll cover that as well. Michelle's here covering Andrew because he's on his holiday, fortunately. Just to cover, children's social care lawyers are difficult to recruit, and there is more money in the market, in the private market, and it is an incredibly challenging, frustrating, upsetting and distressing area to work. So there is a national challenge in terms of recruitment and retention of solicitors in that area. I mean, I think anything in the children's safeguarding world does tend to get a bit of burnout as well because of the pressures that they're experiencing, and we're no different to national. But you know, there's been a lot of work, hasn't there, about national campaigns, but again, it's focused on the adult sector, not necessarily come and change the lives of children. And once we can do things locally, again, there's almost a need, I think, as well, to try and raise the profile of social care for children nationally as well, that clearly has got some traction from an adult perspective.
Thank you. Any other questions from Michelle? No. Claire House gone, please. Just before I forget, because I did ask Andrew to remind me, because he isn't here, so he can't remind me. Our signature of the PSA contract, are we, because the deadline, Debbie, I think it's the 11th of March, are we about ready to do that?
The opt-in to the PSAA framework.
Yeah.
So we've drafted a report for council, because it's a full council decision that's required.
Yeah.
So the report will say that Audit Committee have agreed with the recommendation to go ahead to opt in. So that will be with you sponsoring it, I believe, at council on the 18th. So following on from the Audit Committee report from, I think it was 21st of November, Audit Committee supported the recommendation that we did opt into the national framework to go with PSAA for our auditor appointment from April 23. That report will go into council on the 18th, and hopefully we'll get their support, and then Debbie will send the form off to opt in.
And just on the overall, looking at external auditors' reports, Michelle, obviously they're bringing in the value for money conclusions on that now. So how do you fit that into your routine in terms of how you communicate with the external auditors?
I don't think it's changed massively in terms of what they do. I think they're just having to demonstrate that they're doing what they do. I think all of the things they checked, they did before. There was a bit of overlay in terms of the process they put in place. So obviously they put in place the questionnaire around the questionnaire for the committee, which we reviewed, and a question for the officers. I think I don't know if Lucy's got a view about whether it felt any different from your perspective, but it felt very much the same. I think it's just them fitting it into our routine of, obviously it'll be included in your annual report that goes to council, and that was a requirement of the change of the guidance from the National Audit Office. Do you think there was anything else, Lucy, that felt different?
No, it was just the completion of a self-assessment, so it was just more of a formal process. And the outcome of their work is attached in the annual report as an appendices to be presented to full council, which is the next agenda item.
Michelle, just one final point for me. Obviously, these are things we've debated many times before, but the Business World On project and the payroll transfer from one system to another, we are taking, if you like, a conservative approach and making sure that the data transfer goes as smoothly as it possibly can.
And I presume James will probably give an update at one point, or if Debbie's going to do that. But I think the approach we're taking is that it will take as long as it needs to make sure we've got that assurance that we're doing things right. But I don't know if Debbie wants to.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you.
No, there is a long story and a short story, but the short story is that we want to be assured before we press the button.
That's very reassuring. And I know it's one of those nail-biting situations as always, but all you can do is sort of put as many controls in as you possibly can. And one final one, and we're looking for a long-term financial resilience. Again, probably Debbie would like to come in here as well, but it could get quite tricky, could it not, over the next few years if the government, they've got so many cost pressures on the government that they've this inclination over years and years to force it back onto local authorities. And I partially caught the local council tax rebate in my ear the other day. I thought, oh no, they're going to make us find it. Where's it going to come from? You know, sort of, or push it into the long grass. But those are issues that aren't going to go away, because those cost pressures with rising inflation are going to be with us for some time. I mean, everyone would like to think that the inflationary pressures are going to go in another year's time, but I suspect that's not going to necessarily be the case. Who knows?
I mean, I can pick up on the £150 rebate, if you like.
Yeah.
Hopefully that won't touch us at all.
No,
so
he won't. No, it just caught out the corner of my ear when I put the radio.
The responsibility for paying, I don't think it is really a rebate, because it shouldn't touch people's council tax bills. They'll be expected to pay their council tax, and then they'll get a rebate back through the billing authorities. So hopefully shouldn't touch on our finances at all. I think in terms of the long term, inflation, absolutely. The budget that will go to council on the 18th is suggesting making provision in our budgets to kind of deal with the volatility around inflation, and really recognising the increasing costs, especially in areas like homeschool transport and the care provision, the impact that's having on our longer term cost pressures and the longer term cost of delivering those services. I think we've picked up in the papers some of the key risks around the care reforms. Glenn's mentioned that there is still a great expectation from government that things like price increases and demand increases are still met by local council tax provision, so that the new levy is effectively just funding the reforms, but whether they've got those sums right, I think, is still to be seen. So still a major risk for us, but we're taking a prudent approach in terms of setting our budget. We've got a long-term strategy in place around delivering savings, and a long-term strategy in place about our financial resilience and use of reserves, so it hopefully should see us through.
So again, I think it's the emphasis on having those adequate reserves to see us over a rainy day. I think that was a very sensible choice we made a few years ago, to make sure we didn't anticipate it being quite as rainy as it's been over the last 2 years, but there's always going to be something that comes to test you. So that's great. Thank you very much, Michelle. Any further questions for Michelle? No? Thank you very much, Michelle. Andy. Over to you, please.
Thank you, Chair. I only answer to Andrew on a Sunday when my mother's telling me off, so I didn't realise you were talking to me earlier.
Oh,
so.
Yes, I'm called, because I was christened Susan, and I always find that people call me Susan, it's because I'm going to be rated any second later.
So, as others have indicated this morning, we've had another year of disruption and challenge, but I suppose I'd just like to comment in the terms of the earlier questions about smarter working. I do think we need to recognise and comment on the positive attitude that most of our staff have brought to delivering our services over that period of time. I think it's a credit to most of them that they haven't worked to rule. It would have been very easy for people to have sort of taken their bat and ball home. But most of our staff have put in hours to ensure our services have been well delivered. There will always be exceptions, and you probably all know one or two of those that you can highlight to me, but we can't underestimate the debt that we owe to our workforce that have taken on those challenges. I'd also like to assure members that I genuinely believe our staff are continually looking to find better and more innovative ways of working. And as Debbie indicated before, we're empowering our managers to make sure that that actually happens. Over the last couple of weeks, I've been in the office sort of quite a bit, and it's quite refreshing and reassuring to see so many people that are back in the workplace. One day last week in Lancaster House, I walked through the first floor. It was almost entirely full of engineers, all coming back together, wanting to talk to each other, wanting to work through some of the sort of complexities of the design issues that they've got. And within that building, we're co-locating with our major contractor, Balfour Beatty. So again, it's a two-way process with our major contractors as well. So I don't think we can underestimate the work that's been done. It's not perfect, as Debbie indicated as well. There's a learning curve for all of us. When you come into the office and then find you spend half your day sat on Teams calls, you think, have I got the balance of where I should be and what I'm doing right? And I think a particular thing that Councillor Coupland recognised, the balance between communication and isolation is an ongoing challenge. Some people find that easier than others, and within that there are issues of our ongoing well-being for those people that do find themselves isolated. So we're working that through, and hopefully you'll see benefits. What I would sort of suggest, and sort of I think is reflected in the overall levels of assurance that are in front of you, our customer focus by and large has meant that over the last few months our services have adapted to coming back into being more face-to-face activity. In our waste services, we reflected on the fact that the appointment system hadn't necessarily sort of been to everyone's cup of tea. We've gone back to accepting waste sort of in a personal level. I've used one of our facilities on a number of occasions, and I found that from a customer experience in terms of using that facility. It's on your patch, Councillor Bunny, as you might imagine. It's been quite positive. The attitude of the staff actually working there is positive as well. Our visitor attractions, from a heritage point of view, again, once you've reopened them, people want to come in through the door. Our staff have had to engage with the visitors. And Lincoln Castle and the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight both received awards from Visit England at the end of last year. So again, recognising that we've embraced the way of working differently. And so again, hopefully that's a positive reaction to the staff wanting to actually sort of be seen to be doing the right thing and getting their own reward out of working for us. In terms of our highways activity, again, some degree of pressure in the context of the government decisions to reduce our level of funding. We continue, therefore, to work with our partners, contractors, to make sure that we find better ways of being effective and efficient. Again, that can take time for some of that activity to filter through, but the increased use of the overbanding on pothole repairs, again, is a physical and visible indication of actually the quality of pothole repairs. And again, as members, you've now got more direct information coming to you through the members app that gives you more confidence that things are being addressed. I'm not going to pretend that every pothole is being fixed or every defect is being fixed. There are still pressures in terms of our overall capacity and resource. But again, hopefully that's a recognition that we take seriously the concerns that are raised. Our business support activity, again, specific grants, additional grant scheme that was entered into at the beginning of the last financial year. Again, a reflection on that we recognise that the national systems weren't necessarily dealing with everything. The time, effort and work that went into that, both from my economic development teams, the finance teams, to make that work can't be underestimated, but probably saved a fair number of businesses from actually going to the wall. So again, in the context of actually that, I think we should be proud of what we did, and I know that the audit team are going to just do some work to make sure that in the context of the fraud risks that are attached to that, we had a secure system in place, and I'm confident that we will have on the back of that audit review, given the work that went into it. Our education to home transport activity, it's been identified as part and parcel of the Council's transformation programme, and a detailed programme of work is underway to fundamentally review and overhaul how that service is delivered. Again, that will create a different way of working, a different way of accessing the service. What I'd say at the moment is there's a desire and an ambition from the people involved in that service to actually make that successful. Ultimately, it's tied into making some significant financial savings for the authority in terms of being more effective and efficient about how we actually operate. As set out in the report, though, the big area of concern I'd flag to the committee is in respect of the ongoing pressures of inflationary concerns, how that then plays out to commercial relationships with our major contractors and the supply chains that they have to bring to the table to deliver our major capital projects. Whilst we've got some real good successes on the ground of works that have been completed, Holdingham Roundabout, Rise Home, the LEB, as I say, that's not without some significant challenges behind the scenes to manage the nature of our relationships. That won't get any easier, I'm sure, in the context of the underlying inflation pressures that we're experiencing, and it will ultimately have an impact potentially on what we can actually deliver and whether we have to constrain some of our work accordingly. We have revised our approach. I would say we've become much more commercially astute ourselves. That comes at a cost to be able to do that effectively and appropriately, and it can give rise to conflict and confrontation within the commercial arrangements. Again, it's ultimately, from our perspective, trying to ensure that ultimately we get the best deal for the county council and the best value for money for ourselves. And the other thing I would just flag to members in the context of the ongoing uncertainty about the implications of devolution, the future sort of like arrangements to replace European spending. Whilst the white paper that came out last week sort of provides some more detail, it doesn't answer all of our questions, and that will continue to create sort of some perhaps tension between ourselves, business, government departments and other partners whilst we actually make sense of that and put systems in place to actually make that deliver the longer term outcomes for making sure that the underlying economic position for the county is as good as it possibly can be. the point that those two final points bring together, a lot of the issues we're having to deal with are outside of our direct control, and we have to react and respond to those in a way that is appropriate. We're not necessarily able to influence everything to the absolute extent, but that's a quick resume of some of the key things which might be of interest to the committee.
Thank you, Andy. Mark.
Thank you, Chairman. Civil parking enforcement is marked as a red activity. Why is that? Or is this to do with social distancing and the comment that you've got in there about social distancing and not being able to get too close to parking problems?
Yeah, it's one of those services that we had to deliver differently during the pandemic, and as a consequence of that, at this point in time, it's identified as being in a red risk. At the same time, there are changes coming from government in terms of some of the requirements about how we actually enforce. That guidance has been delayed. It's starting to come through again. It should have gone live, I think, at the beginning of the calendar year. We're now talking about a May date. So it's the uncertainty of actually how we're going to have to deliver the services differently. I don't think it's ultimately a red risk in the context of the implications, but when you're not actually clear of what you're dealing with, it's just right to flag that there may be changes that might cause some tension in the system in the short to medium term.
Right. I've got a second question, if I could raise that at the same time. The assurance level has gone up from 0% to 8%. Is that predominantly COVID related? Is that to do with purely the inflationary costs associated with delivering some of the major projects, or is there something else in there that's causing that as well?
Yeah. Behind this report, there's a detailed set of line-by-line indications of how you get the 100% pot that we're being viewed on. Within that, there are a number of capital projects, and it's the risks associated with all of those capital projects effectively give me that red area of risk, but it is encapsulated in the fact that inflationary pressures, commercial pressures, supply chain pressures. Some of those supply chain pressures are again in the context of some of the supply chains had to work differently, and therefore their costs went up. So for a period of time, obviously remember that people weren't able to sort of share vehicles. So some of our supply chains were sending people to the site in 2 vehicles, so there are increasing costs. So it is largely tied into that area of activity, not any underlying concerns or issues about failings across some of the services.
Are those sort of COVID-related issues now disappearing fast? The inflation ones may not be, but hopefully the COVID ones might be.
So the underlying red risk was a combination of those things. I think the inflationary ones will continue to make sure that they remain as on the red risk register in the context of the implications for us, both in terms of our ability to deliver the projects effectively, but also to be able to afford to deliver those projects and other projects.
I'm sorry, my question was more related to the COVID aspects of it. The inflationary ones will be sorted out, I dare say, by the government. Keep our fingers crossed. But it was more to do with the contractors having to react to or wanting to react to the COVID restrictions. Are they starting to disappear now?
Yes, definitely.
Additional costs?
Definitely, as I indicated earlier, we're co-locating with Balfour Beatty in Lancaster House. In some respects, their approach to coming back into the workplace was ahead of ours. We were perhaps a little bit more precautionary in terms of actually bringing people into the workplace. They were respecting the fact that they were operating from our premises, but in the context of actually going out on site now, I'm not aware of any significant constraints being imposed by COVID. We seem to have been relatively fortunate over the winter period as well, is that the impact of the Omicron sort of variant hasn't ended up in sort of significant pressures with large groups of our workforce being unable to actually be at work and attending site, and that's reflected in our contractor workforce as well.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Mark. Andrew.
Thank you, Chair. Declaration of interest. From 16 years ago, I was principal of the college that was most affected by home-to-college transport. Basically, if the county had taken it away, you could have closed Stamford College. I'm seeking assurance that in your review of home-to-school college transport, that there's no danger of an inadvertent restriction of choice, student choice, i.e. there's only one place to go that is got transport funded, and therefore that restricts the opportunity for the 16-year-old to have that choice. Secondly, that you have consulted the college principals as part of your review, and also that you are mindful of the fact that the skills agenda requires that as many people get vocationally relevant qualifications as possible, and FE colleges are the places that provide the large majority of those. So I always get very nervous when there are any discussions around reviewing home to college transport, and during my tenure at Stamford College I had to see off 2 or 3 debates of that type when one extreme position was we'll stop it all, and that would have devastating consequences for student choice and also the viability of the FE colleges.
Could I just come in, because I think we're probably confusing two things. So the review that we're doing is looking at our procurement and contract management arrangements which are in place within the existing policies. I think any changes to entitlement would be a policy change, and clearly a policy change is not within the auspice of that review because it's an officer review. Any change to the policy would be a political decision, would be subject to statutory consultation. So I can't give you any assurances about what the council may or may not do in relation to post-16 transport policy-wise, but it's not within the scope of this work, but it is a political issue and a matter for the council that clearly officers would not be able to give you assurance on.
If I may add, in the context of the way the project has been managed, there is a series of stakeholder engagement sessions, including going out to head teachers, to the principals of the colleges, so that the fears that you quite rightly flag are understood and managed effectively. It's about where and when we can influence it. Ultimately, as you've perhaps heard from Glenn and might hear from Heather in the context of children's services, within all of this, though, there is the ability to get to a point where people are taking ownership and responsibility of their own travel arrangements rather than being over-reliant on the authority providing facilities, because, again, that is a significant burden on our budget, and as I indicated, there is a financial saving that is now attached to that activity. So we do have to make sure that we find ways of working more effectively in that area to actually save effectively a £5 million budget level going forward.
If I may come back, Chair, I hear that, and those are mellifluous words that might have impacts on families, and if we're talking about addressing inequalities, education is one of the key components of that, and therefore I would not wish a family and a young person to make a choice on their post-16 educational activity purely on the grounds of finance.
Understood.
I'm on. The current policy is transport to your nearest college, regardless of which course. So if the nearest college doesn't do a course that that isn't in your preference, you don't get an entitlement to the next nearest. That was changed. So it was just to clarify that point.
Well, obviously,
yeah.
As long as there's consultation with the principals, that doesn't.
Okay, Andrew, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Debbie. Thank you, Andy. Stephen.
Just a very quick one on the homeschool transport you're talking about. I'm well aware of buses which do run, for people, but in the rural areas, are we consulting with those people who've got to get to the bus stops, which in itself can be a major problem for some students and restrict the amount they can do? It's the consultation I'm more interested in than the answer.
So again, at the right time, we will make sure we engage effectively with the parents of the children, but in the context of our role and responsibility is getting people from the bus stop to their place of education. There is still a level of responsibility on parents the older children to actually make sure that they can get from A to B. As you're aware, Councillor Bunny, there are a range of different ways in which people get from home to school. It's not just buses, there are a range of other providers as well, and it's about trying to make sure that we make most effective use of that resource. And again, certain individual cases are a heavy drain on the budgets for how they are currently delivered and managed. So we will be looking to make sure it's the most effective, most efficient and most financially viable way for everybody concerned.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Andy. Could I just ask you a couple of questions? On the waste management, Andy, obviously, obviously the districts collect it and we get rid of it. I might have said that. Yes. What's the market like for disposing of recyclables at the moment? Because obviously we're looking at, well, certainly in the area I live in, and I think there's a move is not to separate out a lot of the paper from the general recyclers. But is there an element, is there a growing, I say, number one, has there been a noticeable a reduction in people's enthusiasm for recycling during the pandemic? And number two, the market in terms of being able to sell it, what's that like compared to what it was before?
I think the underlying issue during the pandemic is that waste arisings have increased.
Yeah.
So probably a consequence of more people being at home and disposing of more of their waste on a day-to-day basis into their own domestic refuse. So that in itself is a challenge and an issue. I think in the context of the recyclables market, there's always a level of volatility, and it can ebb and flow depending on what materials are deemed to be attractive or not, and therefore the value that comes with them. The trial of separate card and paper collection, initially in Boston, subsequently in North Kesteven, and due to be rolled out into West Lindsey from this April, has demonstrated that, as the business case proposed, that actually getting better quality of card and paper, that increases the value from that particular waste stream. As a consequence of that, each of the other districts is working forward to actually bring that forward themselves, and that again plays well into the requirements of the Resources Act that was passed in the context of probably over the next couple of years we'll also then need to be looking at collecting food waste separately as well. So I would say that the general public reaction to that has been perhaps better than might have been expected. Don't underestimate the time and effort and the work that was put in to educate people. People going out, people knocking on doors, explaining to people why maybe their bins weren't getting collected. And it's some of the detail that we all need to understand. So your cardboard pizza carton doesn't need to go into your cardboard and paper waste, because the grease on it means that it's contaminated. So it's the little things. You could be contaminating a full bin of good, perfectly good cardboard and paper just because you had to take away pizza last night and you threw the carton on the top of the bin. So those sort of things are about educating people, and we've all got a duty to actually try and understand that. But I would say at the moment, the general position is one of positivity, and I'd link that as well to the wider understanding that the general public also have of actually working towards zero carbon and carbon targets. They recognise that recycling is an integral part of that agenda as well.
And are we, well, number two, are we keen to promote the reuse aspect of these things rather than the dump it ones? And also, what are we doing about soft plastics like bread wrappers and those sort of things?
Yeah, so yes, we continue to ensure that the different approaches about reuse, because there's a hierarchy, recycling should be below the element of reuse, so that continues to be part and parcel of the overarching strategy that's in place, and the communications that go out to the public, and again delivering that message in partnership with the districts as the collection authorities. In terms of the role of the industry to reduce packaging and things like that, that is being dealt with through other channels. Again, the industry itself is being expected and asked to do that. So we work very closely with obviously a lot of the food producers, the logistic companies. Their contractual requirements through their ultimate clients, the supermarkets, is they are being asked to do less to make sure that the overall carbon footprint of the goods is reduced as well. So again, ultimately, I think the industry will tackle that agenda rather than us having to intervene directly. Comes back to one of my points earlier. There are certain things that are within our direct control, and there are other matters that are a matter of influence.
And just on one last point, are we seeing the footfall improve to the tourist attractions, and do we hope to see more international visitors come the summer?
Footfall's definitely increased on the back of the restrictions having been lifted. In terms of the international travel, I suppose that's again something that we can't directly influence, and only time will tell whether we get that influx back of international travellers. I would argue that our facilities and attractions will be ready for that if that actually occurs. If it doesn't, there's a fair chance that obviously there will be a continued sort of staycation market in terms of people coming back and visiting our attractions. We've got a large profile of activities planned for the castle in the summer, so again, it should make return visitors realise there are things to come back to in terms of the other events and other attractions that will be taking place at the castle.
Yep, that's great. Thank you. I take your point on the highways inflation. Again, it's going to be damaging to repairs perhaps, and also trying to get those larger schemes delivered within budgets.
Again, largely outside of our control, but we are continuing, as I say, to engage effectively with the market, our contractors, to create as many efficiencies as we possibly can, so that we ultimately don't end up being in a position where we can deliver less with our overall budget. But it's a challenge.
Very great challenge, that one, yes.
Thank you. Just very quickly on the waste, I think I would want it to be said that as a West Lindsey resident and councillor and so on, I've been very impressed with the presentations which have been given ahead on the introduction of the fourth bin and the lessons that have been learnt from the other projects, and I think that's a good bit of work there. The one area which does seem to cause a lot of problem with waste, and I know it's not necessarily now for answer, but needs to be resolved, I think, is fly tipping, and also the removal of waste from individuals' houses. Now, I know that that goes across the authorities, but it does seem to be a major problem, certainly in the rural areas, that I'm not quite sure how easy it's going to be addressed, but something has to be done, I believe.
Commenting back on the issue around the fourth bin, the whole purpose of having a pilot in one of the districts was to learn lessons, and so I'm glad you're recognising that and hearing that in the presentations that are being given. Too often a pilot's run and we don't actually act upon the things that have come out of the pilot, so that's positive. There isn't an easy answer to the fly tipping conundrum. Some of the anecdotal evidence was that because our waste recycling centres were being operated on an appointment basis, that was making it easier for people to resort to fly tipping. I genuinely don't believe that is the case, particularly when you look at the nature of a lot of the stuff that is fly tipped. By and large, it's not general domestic waste. It is from a certain fraternity of the business community who are cutting corners. I do know that the districts take a lot of time and effort to try and identify if there's any evidence within that waste to enable them to take prosecutions. I think the general public view is it's unacceptable, inappropriate, but it is one of those challenging areas. If we were to look to actually remove it all directly ourselves, and when I say ourselves, I mean across the partnership of the districts and the county, the cost burden for that and probably the raising of expectations that we will always clean up after people would continue to create a problem. So it's there, it's been debated, but unfortunately, Councillor Bunny, there isn't an easy answer.
If I might, I agree. I understand that it's a sort of a commercial interest problem, and of course, where the confusion appears to be amongst the public is the fact that the household waste centres don't take the commercial, and they can't see that link, and that's something which needs to be done at some stage.
Yeah. There is obviously now the permit system in place, which allows a certain amount of trade waste at the lower ends, but as I say, I still think we're talking about a type of businessman or business that isn't really interested in doing the job properly. Hopefully I'm not saying anything that's going to libel me or anything.
Lucy, I think you wanted to come in.
Just a gentle reminder to the committee about the role and remit of this committee.
We are getting
this
straying a little bit
committee
off the assurance. But
yes, so this is around assurance, not about scrutiny. So I'm just sort of setting that reminder gently.
Thank you, Lucy, for bringing us back on track. We understand what you mean. Okay. So, any more questions for Andy, particularly on an assurance level in terms of our resilience against financial pressures, etc.? Peter.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I think these sort of meetings are not for detail. They're more for the round and for us to speak to the directorates in the round, which I think we should do. We shouldn't get them into a lot of detail. So on Andy's director at the moment, I look at it over a year, what happens and what you see, and whether there's any moans, groans, etc. And I think generally the directorate's been pretty good. I think it's operated pretty well, what I can see. You know, I know we don't meet a lot as councillors anymore, but I do speak to a lot of them, and that's where you get knowledge of what's happening within your directorates. You know, because if they've got moans and groans, no doubt probably other people have. You know, where Andy's concerned, fine. I think he's always fair and reasonable with any responses I see to people in my communities, to me MPs. So great. I think, you know, it's challenging. It will be for a while. You know, don't give the weekend job up, Andy, either. I think just keep cracking on. So you've got to look at it as a round, and I think there's always housekeeping to be tidied up, and we know that. Things crop up, that's not quite right, we've got to work it right. But no, generally good.
Thank you for that feedback, Councillor Coupland. Again, in the context of most of my services, they are what we term universal services, so everyone sees them day in, day out, everyone's aware of them, and dare I say, everyone's an expert in those particular fields, so it is challenging. No doubt, given that you didn't want Glenn's job, you probably don't want my job either.
Thank you. Any further questions, Andy? Thank you very much, Andy. Thank you. Excuse me. In terms of the other assurance reports, Lucy.
I understand Heather and James are on Teams.
Oh yes, okay, that's lovely. So do we want to pass over to them, so that's okay? Thank you. Yeah, Heather's fine.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I won't repeat what's already been said about the challenges of the pandemic and the continuing impact on service delivery. I would like to say how proud I am of the way in which the children's workforce has responded. As you already know, our frontline teams got back to face-to-face delivery, safeguarding children very early on, and I can now confirm that that is the case across all of our community-based services as restrictions have eased. Our safeguarding teams have adapted quickly to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 and find new approaches for supporting children and families. We have had a rise in the number of children in care, and despite remaining well below the national figures, that is bringing a cost pressure, and we've implemented an extensive children in care transformation programme, which is changing the way we work and delivering more children's homes in Lincolnshire to reduce our exposure to what is a very volatile independent market for children's placements at the moment. Another area of challenge for us is the lack of national school testing. It means we don't have the wide range of information we would normally have to evaluate and monitor the effectiveness of our schools and academies. The education team are working closely with schools to manage that, and they're supporting schools and academies to implement the extensive government-funded catch-up programmes. The educational progress of our children in care is a particular focus for us, and our virtual school team is working hard with schools and social workers and carers to provide additional support for those children. Finally, in terms of our section of the report, I'd like to highlight that our children's centres are now fully open again, and face-to-face activities are being enjoyed by children and their families across the county. Our new early childhood strategy is supporting more integrated working for our youngest children, and that's ensuring that we respond to the impact that lockdowns had on babies and toddlers and their families as they had less interaction than they would normally have. Our health visiting team worked face-to-face throughout the pandemic, and it was really specific to us that happened, because in many parts of the country where the council doesn't deliver health visiting, health visitors were deployed to help with the NHS response and the vaccination programme. We didn't do that. Our health visitors were working with Lincolnshire families throughout, and actually that decision by NHS Trust was seen as a risk and was not permitted in the second lockdown. And I think what we're starting to see is the impact of that, as our performance is above national and statistical neighbours for our health visiting teams. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll pass over now to the members. So is Councillor Mark Allen. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, it's Heather, I think, is it?
Heather? Yeah.
I'd like to just go back to a question that the Chair raised, and Debbie, the Chief Executive, answered it in part, in my view. And it's to do with the fact that there was a very worrying 500,000 number that was on the radio a little while ago of children that seem to have disappeared off the school register or haven't appeared on the school register when they perhaps should have done. And the Children's Commissioner raising this as an issue because it's not clear why this has happened, and there may be a number of reasons, that perhaps some of which require investigation in terms of children self-isolating or children in families that are very, very concerned about COVID, or just children that have given up with school. And a lack of knowledge about exactly what the various reasons might be. And that's really the worrying part, I think, is having that understanding. The Chief Executive, I think, dealt with the issues that the ones that you've got on the radar have been looked at, and that's good. But have you any idea of how many of these 500,000 children might live in the Lincolnshire area, and what you're doing to actually try and get hold of the information associated with them so that we can find out why they're not where they ought to be?
Yeah, thank you. And sorry, I should have introduced myself. I'm Heather Sandy. I'm the Director for Children's Services. So I think, that's a really, really clear worry for all of us. And the answer basically is no, we don't know how many of those children are from the Lincolnshire area, because we don't know the children who haven't been enrolled in school. It's not as easy to track them through as children move around the county and the country. What we do know is where we've seen a rise of children going off a school register without another school being known. And those children are classed as children missing in education. And we're able to track those children and look at how we can support them. We see an increase in those numbers in the areas where we've got greater communities that have moved here from other countries. And what we saw in the pandemic was definitely some of those families choosing to return to their home countries. They don't always tell us that's what's going to happen, and they don't always tell schools, and it's schools who have a responsibility to track those children. We do hear anecdotally, because often they might have family or friends who'll say, oh, well, they've gone back to Lithuania or Poland. But actually, we don't know that, and until we can confirm that, they remain on a list of children missing education. And what we do is we have a national list, so we'll exhaust all of the opportunities we have to try and locate those children, and then we will work with the national team, and the national team can look for tracking those children to see if they've moved, if they can track them through the routes in terms of as they've exited the country, or if they've arrived in other parts of the country, they can flag that up to us. It continues to be a concern, and one that we need to monitor. What I am pleased about is we used to see children exiting our mainstream schools through the exclusion route, and actually we've had a significant decrease in those exclusions over recent times in Lincolnshire, and we're now one of the higher performing local authorities in that area.
Thank you, Heather. Mark, is that got to come back?
The question is, I suppose you agreed to a certain extent with the the point behind the question. is this going to be resource intensive, and is there going to be some sort of endpoint to it? Or is it a question of, chipping away at the problem? Because the real concern is that there's going to be somebody that's missed out there, and nobody hears about it until it appears on the front pages of the newspapers, and that's really what's concerning from a safeguarding point of view, and our responsibilities as councillors in terms of children's safeguarding.
So the problems are complex ones. So when a child leaves the register of a school, we do know about them, we do have their address, unless they've moved, and then we can do some work around that. And schools have a duty placed on them to monitor the attendance of children, and if children don't attend schools, schools are required to call those parents and understand why they're not attending school, and to highlight to us if there are problems around that attendance. If a school can't get in touch with the child or the family for an extended period of time, then that child becomes designated as a child missing education. Schools will routinely do a visit to that home. They will try and explore with neighbours if they've seen the family, have the family moved, and schools do a really good job in that space. But you're absolutely right. If a family chose to remove their child from school, move to another part of the country, and not tell us where they are, there is no way for the individual school or the council to know that, and that is a risk. What we do in terms of elective home education, because that is slightly different, they are required to register with us around elective home education, and there is a move now nationally to begin a national registration of elective home educators, so that as elective home educators move around counties, that can also be tracked. But you're absolutely right, there are children who can disappear from our schools. It doesn't happen in Lincolnshire very often, but it can happen, and it's very difficult to track them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. It's very informative. Thank you. And your assurances there regarding the safeguarding, because obviously that's one of our major risks, and will always be that because of the nature of the fact wanting to protect children as much as we possibly can. Members, has anyone else got any questions for Heather? No? Well, thank you for that, Heather. I'll note again, it was an issue that Glenn raised in adult social care as well, that you also have some challenges around the acquisition of special equipment, and you've got a bit of supply chain disruption there, and one presumes a bit of inflation as well.
Yes, that's right, Chair, we do. I have to say those supply chains are starting to ease now, and we are starting to get that equipment through. But that's definitely been a challenge for us, and we are seeing some inflation there.
Okay, thank you. So may be a little bit of budgetary pressure on there in the future with all the sort of emerging increased costs we've got. So thank you for that, Heather. That's very informative. Thank you once again. Okay. And now we have James. Can I hand over to you, James?
Thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm James Drury. I'm Executive Director for Commercial. I think the good news is that I'll be relatively brief, and the reason for that is that the nature of my services are enabling and supporting the Council to deliver effective and efficient services, and many of the areas that I would have covered have been discussed in the extensive discussions that you've had so far. So I'll try not to sort of dwell on things for too long, but obviously happy to take any questions as well. So initially, Debbie spoke in some detail about the transformation programme. That's been a significant piece of work for a group of my staff and my teams there, and they've been working hard on that with the rest of the organisation, and I think that's now beginning to work well. Andy and Heather have both mentioned construction inflation and other forms of inflation around materials, and again that's impacted on things like our property projects and also on our availability of getting equipment and things like that as well, particularly in the early days around some PPE type equipment. And again, my team that support Glenn's area there in delivering those and supporting those care services were heavily involved in that. When it comes to COVID, working with COVID and the restrictions and now moving to smarter working, again, two of my teams in particular have been really heavily involved in that. One is IMT and one is property. So initially, property were engaged in ensuring we could maintain the buildings as safely as possible to maintain safe working environments despite restrictions, because there were some reasons that some people had to come into the office, either due to business need or for personal need. And again, the support that's been offered for them is through my property team has been significant, and they've worked hard there on stuff that they probably never dreamt they'd need to be working on, to be perfectly honest. And again, when it comes to IMT, 2 years ago, we were in a position where staff who worked from home when we first started this, because we had to work from home, had to go onto a rota. And the reason for that was that our technology and our infrastructure wasn't strong enough, if you like, and suitable enough to cope with virtual and home working. We've radically changed all of that in the last couple of years, and we're now in a position that we can work effectively from any location. And in the vast majority of cases, that's working well. There are still a few teething problems, and there are still a few issues relating to specific systems, but generally it's working very well, and it's been an absolute step change, and the pace of that has been accelerated hugely because of the necessity of making us able to work efficiently under initially COVID restrictions. And that's a really good stepping stone then for the technology that we need for smarter working as well. The other area that was mentioned was business world, and I know Michelle answered a question, as did Debbie, on that. Just to confirm, Chair, yes, everything is being done not intentionally at a slow pace, but at a very thorough pace. And as a result of that, it is taking longer than we'd originally planned. I think there are a few reasons for that. One is that thoroughness and our desire and absolute assurance that we can't get it wrong. Secondly is the complex nature of the data and the rules that we operate within Lincolnshire, and some of the complexities that brings. And as a result of that, we need quite specialist people to be able to undertake this testing work. And inevitably, they're the same people that are, in this example, running our payroll on a day-to-day basis. So we can't pull them away from running normal payroll exclusively to do this, and therefore we are working as effectively as we can with a limited pool of people with the right skills to be able to make this work effectively. The other example that we've mentioned was schools as well, and how we're working with them on Business World. And again, understandably, schools who are certainly have been struggling with attendance from teachers due to COVID, with the new testing regimes that they were heavily involved in, with distance learning that they were doing, all of that. Then when we are trying to talk to them about providing us with resource and capacity to test things around teachers' pay, for instance, you can imagine there's been a real conflict for them around prioritisation. So it hasn't been easy, but we are making progress on it now, but it has taken longer than we planned. The other areas that are mentioned are around ICT and some of the older systems where, as a result of that, we can't completely modernise everything. We're in the process of doing that, but unfortunately, it is quite complex, and we can't just flick a button and move to a new world, if you like. There's a transitional period, and we are successfully managing through that at the moment. And I'm confident that we are tackling the issues that we need to be tackling there. And I think, as a quick summary, that's probably covered most of the areas, Chair, along with the things that have been discussed earlier in the meeting. So I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thank you, James. I'll pass over to the members. Mark, please.
Thank you, Chairman. It's to do with Business World and the INT issue. The Business World, I think, came to us some time ago, and one of the reasons we're given for the amount of time it was taking was to do with the project management changes, I think, that were taking place, which seemed to be somewhat of an issue. And I do accept all the comments that you just made about the complexity of the issues and the need to ensure that the systems do work, and having the ability then to, almost run two systems together to check one against the other. But is there a but it does. But the consequence of doing that, does mean that you almost run the two systems together, you know, because you always want the sort of security that you can use the old systems if you have to, or to feed information into the new system. Is there a target date for actually moving on to the new system, or is it always going to be sometime in the future, as soon as we know with 100% confidence or 110% confidence that we can actually, you know, dump the old system and run with the new one? So, you know, because I think this has been reported similarly to a certain extent, although there is a positive comment about we seem to be getting towards the end in a number of the annual reports. So have we got a deadline date?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So currently there isn't a drop dead live date, and the reason for that is that what we are doing is we are taking the data from our current system and then running it in our new system, exactly as you said. So it's not quite a full parallel run, but we take it at a snapshot in time and put it into the new system. To ensure that we get this right, we've planned to do that 3 times. Each time we do that, the follow-up time should be significantly quicker, because each time we do the A run, so run number 1, which we've now completed, we come up with issues that we need to resolve. We resolve all those issues, we then do number 2, and when we do number 2, the expectation is that we should find that all the errors we've corrected remain corrected, and we would hope there would be very few additional things coming out of the woodwork at that point. Where we are in that process is that we've done number 1, and we found some issues which we've corrected, and that work has progressed well. We are in the process now of running number 2, and I think after we have run number 2, we should then be in a much stronger position to be able to anticipate what that live date is, and therefore the date that we switch on that new system for all of our organisation. At this stage in time, if I just predicted a date, it is not particularly wise to do that, in as much as we need to ensure that that second run does correct all the things that we are confident we've corrected, but we need to actually see evidence of that by running that second run. So we are probably, you know, a month or 2 away from being in a position to know that that's worked effectively, and based on that we can then provide what we believe to be an achievable and accurate live date.
Switched it off rather than switched it on. I hope you can hear me now. Thank you very much for that. So I can now understand.
I can now, yes.
I can now understand how you are intending to bring this project to a conclusion through your runs 1, 2, and 3, which is very good news, particularly if there isn't a great deal of time between runs 1, 2, and 3. And hopefully you're confident then that there won't be similar discussions taking place in 12 months or 6 months' time about runs 4, 5, and 6.
Thank you. I completely understand your question, and at this point in time, we see no. You know, many places would have done 1 run or probably 2. To be honest, we are being cautious by doing 3. We are, as I say, correcting things that are wrong, and we would expect to find quite a few things. And when I say wrong, some of them are data issues, some of them are around how the new system works compared to the old system, and some historic data throws up some issues that, with the best planning in the world, you wouldn't necessarily have anticipated. So we would have always expected run 1 to be the most the biggest area of workload to do, and then we're back to having the capacity, especially during COVID and especially during other priorities, with the skill sets required to put those things right. We have achieved that, and as I say, I'd have no reason to believe that we would need any more than 3 runs. I do think, though, that because of the assurance we need to give to get this right, 3 is the appropriate number on this for this system.
Yes, thank you for that, Joe. So I would agree in view of the fact that you know, we had the problems with the payroll last time. I think the contractor underestimated the absolute complexity of the organisation's payroll and HR position. Certainly the payroll is very complicated. And I think we've got to, you know, we've got to include schools there as well. It's very important that we get that correct for ourselves and everybody else. Just one question. You did mention legacy systems. Are we now moving away from having bespoke software and buying something that somebody else is using?
Thank you, Chair. That's exactly what we're doing. So I think there's a couple of points to make, really. One is that we would normally, if we buy any new system now, we would look for it to be a cloud-based system, as it's called. And that means that we don't have the servers on site. They are in the cloud, a bit like the way that you'd operate with Microsoft and Amazon through your home devices and things. And we also are pushing very hard to buy off-the-shelf products that we do not then customise for Lincolnshire. Now, that means that there are times when our work practices will need to change to fit the system, as opposed to writing lots of code to alter a system to fit our processes. And some of the complexities we see on Business World are because we did that in the past, and we wrote the system and designed the system around how we operated. And as a result, it's very complex and it's very specific to Lincolnshire, and that makes it difficult to support and costly to support. So you're absolutely right. We are looking to standardise systems and have them off the shelf and normally be cloud-based. There are still some applications within local government that there isn't a sensible cloud offer, so I cannot put my hand on heart and say everything will go to the cloud very quickly. It does depend on the market and how it reacts and responds with the development of systems. But that would be our principle when we are looking at commissioning or moving to new systems.
Thank you, James. That's we get a lot of assurance from that. But and obviously that's a very common sense approach in view of how dramatically computer software has moved on even in the last 10 years. I mean, I come from a accountancy background, and you know, we used to have to download software and everything, and now everything's in the cloud. And you know, obviously you have professional companies you deal with who actually have can offer you a level of data security and everything, and then that takes us away from the issues we might have of data loss in an emergency for the county council property as well. Just one further question. The ICT PSN compliance, presumably we can't comply with that because of some of the old legacy software we've got.
That's exactly right. We've made significant progress, and it's the same with the PSN and the card payments. The same issue, really. We've made significant progress. We know exactly what needs to be done. But with some of those systems, it would be lovely for me just to switch them off and say, that's it, we can be compliant. The problem with that is that we are still reliant on some of them to run some of our, or support the running of some of our services. And that's back to moving to the cloud and moving to off-the-shelf products. So it's all tied together, Chair. You're absolutely right. And I think probably the biggest example is the way that we are now using Microsoft products as a sort of universal product across the council. Some people will love that, some people won't, but at least there's a standardisation to it. That means it's much easier and cheaper to support. We get it upgraded whenever Microsoft choose to upgrade it, which can, again, cause us some issues because it's out of our control, but it means it's bang up to date. It's as security conscious and safe as anything can be. And that isn't to guarantee that there won't be a cyber attack at some point, because I suspect there will in this day and age. But we are at least knowing that we've got, you know, you could argue the best brains in the world to be able to sort out those issues, as opposed to one man and his dog, which is the situation we perhaps have been in the past.
Okay. That's great, James. Thank you so much for those assurances. Any further questions for James? No, thank you once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Oh, yes, okay. So if we could have the fire and rescue one. Yeah. Stacey. Oh, yes, it's Ryan. Stacey. Yeah. Okay. Hello, both.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, hopefully
Hello.
you can hear me okay.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
I will keep it fairly brief. I think there's probably a couple of areas that I'd like to draw your attention to in the report, areas we'd like to provide assurance on. The first one being our prevention activity. It's been done to death in this meeting and over a course of meetings throughout the last 2 years. But the impact of COVID has meant that we've had to deliver some of our protection activity slightly differently. Clearly, we define a group of people in the community as being most vulnerable from fire. We've done a lot of work to be really targeted around that. And of course, what that has meant is that our desire to work in those areas has been affected by COVID, because typically they are the clinically extremely vulnerable. And clearly we have a responsibility to prevent the spread of COVID in the community as much as preventing fire. So we are behind where we would like to be on that in terms of delivering fire prevention to the most vulnerable in the community. It is a top priority area of work for this next coming year. And I'm reasonably confident that we'll be able to increase activity in that area. And indeed, we are back to normal now. That's not withstanding the fact that we are behind where we would have liked to have been without the impact of COVID. The other area I'd like to touch upon is actually an area where we've had increased assurance since the last assurance report. It's against the backdrop of Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Service report, which was published in December of last year, following an inspection which was undertaken in May of last year. And that timeline is important because we've done a significant amount of work between May and December when the report was published. Now, I'd like to touch on some of the activity we've done there. So the report found that in terms of our protection function, which is our statutory responsibility to enforce against the fire safety order, they weren't assured that we were able to deliver our risk-based inspection programme. So that's where we designate a certain number of properties which are of higher risk, and then we commit to go and inspect those premises. So typically they're sleeping risk type premises where there's a considerable risk to life in those properties. We've identified 427 properties which we would go and inspect on an annual basis and work with those building owners to ensure that they comply with the fire safety order. That's in addition to our other statutory duties. So we undertake petroleum licensing for the County Council. We undertake licensing inspections, building control consultations, etc. And we also work in sports stadiums with our local authority partners. We are delivering against all our statutory duties. The concern that the inspectorate had when they came in May was that we had a reduced capacity in terms of the skills we had in our team. We identified back in 2019 that the number of people we had in the team was not sufficient to deliver our risk-based inspection programme. We did recruit and train those, but there is a 2-year lead-in time. What we knew was that come September of last year, we would have the right number of resources with the right skills. Those individuals would have completed their training, they would have completed their mentoring phase of their development, and they'll be up to speed and able to deliver inspections in those high-risk premises. The inspectorate weren't so comfortable that we would be able to do the full risk-based inspection programme in 6 months. We reckon that we did have the capability to do that. We have been monitoring that, as you would expect, since September, and I'm pleased to report that we report on a weekly basis, and currently we are absolutely on track to deliver inspections in all those high-risk areas, and then move on to next year and begin the round of inspections again. We are currently mitigating the risk of losing some key members of staff in the next 12 months. We are bringing people into the department early, and we've been bringing them in over the last 12 months to be able to take up some of those key positions. But it is a challenge we face. Clearly, the ability to work from home has meant that a number of key individuals across the sector now have the ability to work nationally, where they would have only worked locally and regionally. So like a lot of areas of the business, we are suffering slightly with that. The only other area of concern that we have is on-call recruitment. So at the on-call recruitment and the on-call staffing model that we use is fragile nationally. Clearly, we rely on people in the local community wanting to become on-call firefighters. There is a potential, again, the benefit of people working from home is that they will be available to be on-call firefighters during the day, should their full-time employer be comfortable to lose them during those core office hours, which is the potential of a benefit for us. So we are exploring that, and as is the rest of the sector. It's not going to be a short-term win. We recognise that at the minute we currently need 26 fire engines to be permanently crewed 24 hours a day in certain key locations, and the other fire engines provide us with the capability of operating at more protracted incidents. We're doing a bit of internal audit work this year to make sure that the systems that we have in place are fit for purpose. We believe they are, but we want to seek that scrutiny from the audit team as well this year. I'm happy to take any questions or comments that anyone might have on those two areas.
Yes, I have Councillor Mark Allen. Mine.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Ryan. You've really picked up on one of the points that I was going to raise with you, which is to do with the risk-based inspections. So you've given us quite a bit of information, both in the report and in your talk just now. I just wanted to return back to it a little bit so that you can perhaps illustrate further a concern that I've got. I think what you said is that you've effectively increased resources and training so that you think you can provide the full service as of April 2022 in terms of undertaking the risk-based inspections. Is that correct?
It's slightly more nuanced than that. We actually increased the resources in terms of the physical number of people in the department some 12 months ago. Went through a recruitment process and established the department fully. It then takes about 2 years for those individuals to gain the qualifications and experience to be able to undertake the full range of the role. So they can undertake inspections in lower risk premises, which is helpful and useful for us. But in order to progress those high risk premises, they need a greater experience in the built environment and inspecting against the regulatory reform order or the fire safety order. We've had that capability. We've been up to full establishment since September. In terms of the qualifications and the experience, but we've actually had the right number of people in the department for some 12 to 18 months.
Right, but does that mean that you'll be able to undertake the full duties as of April 2022, which isn't far away now? We're 2 months away from that.
Yeah, we actually expect to be able to complete the risk-based inspection this year.
Okay.
So despite only having had 6 months of capacity available to us, we've shuffled our resources around. So another thing we've been doing is the high-rise residential buildings have all needed auditing. So we've used a different section of staff to do that in the first half of the year, and pushed our high-risk inspections against the risk-based inspection program into the second half of the year. That wouldn't be the choice in how to progress it. We'd rather to smooth out some of those peaks and troughs throughout the year to make sure that we have some slippage. One of the key areas we have is towards getting into care homes. Care homes are one of our high risk areas, and of course there is a risk that they begin to close due to outbreaks of COVID, which then puts slippage beyond our control. So we would rather have a full 12 calendar months to be able to achieve that.
Fine. I was just trying to set the scene so that I could raise the point that I wanted to really raise, and that's to do with the fact it's succession planning to a certain extent, which is marked as red in the risk. And it is that in 22-23 some resources will be retiring. Can you confirm that you're already looking to, or you have already in fact started to replace those staff that are retiring, so that you maintain both your resources and its qualifications as a whole, and the capability to continue to undertake the risk-based inspections?
Yeah, quite right. So what we have done is developed a career pathway through particularly our operational workforce. One of the things we can do with our operational staff is provide them with the qualification a lot earlier in their careers, which means they can actually begin to utilise that time that they have on operational watches with a qualification, undertaking some of those lower level inspections, which greatly reduces the amount of time it takes them to get up to that full competence and full experience level when they move into the specialist fire protection department.
That's fine, thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you. Mark, any further questions for Ryan on the fire rescue? Ryan, could I just ask you one thing? You obviously, in your concluding paragraph, mentioned the Grenfell Tower situation. I mean, in terms of our exposure as a county council, is that with us being predominantly a rural area, and is that something we can cope with in the second phase, or are there issues you think that might come to prominence later on?
It's certainly not something that we're immune from fully. Clearly, the scale of the risk is significantly different. To put it into context, Greater Manchester has about 490 high-rise buildings. So high-rise building under the legislation is a building over 18 metres or 7 stories, whichever comes first. Within Lincolnshire, we have about 19. So the risk is significantly different. We're resourced to do that piece of work. There are some things we are tracking on the horizon, and one of those is that medium-rise buildings, so buildings underneath 18 metres, but still of a significant number of floors, may come within scope. We're working very closely with the HSE, who under the Building Safety Bill will become much more involved at the gateway planning process in terms of ensuring some of those buildings are safe. And we're working very closely with our local authority partners to make sure we're involved in that initial gateway. We're already involved at Gateway 1 from a planning perspective, but making sure that we can capture that for those high-rise residential buildings.
Yeah, and do those regulations apply to student accommodation as well?
It's a slightly more grey area. Yes, they will do, as will care facilities and Crown premises. So anything that comes under that threshold will be included.
So it would include hospital buildings and things like that ultimately as well?
Because they're not residential, they're care facilities. But yeah, we would still work with those in a very similar way. So we would still make sure that those buildings are fit for purpose.
Yeah, but it comes down again to, you know, in your line of work, prevention is the key, is it not?
I think from our perspective, it's about making sure that we're involved in the very initial planning consultation stage to ensure that buildings, for example, aren't built with just one escape staircase and those kinds of things. That although buildings are built to the minimum standard, there are a lot of contextual features which make buildings not necessarily safe from an operational perspective. So it's making sure that some of those considerations are taken into account before spades are put in the ground.
And are you routinely consulted when older buildings are retrofitted?
Some of the time, yeah.
Compromise the original safety features.
That's quite correct, yeah. So, and of course, we do have to be mindful about the fabric of buildings, the use they're being put to, and again, working with planning colleagues to make sure that any building retrofitting is sympathetic, but complies with legislation.
Okay, so thank you, Ryan, for that. That's assurance. Any further questions? No? Well, thank you once again. Okay, thank you. Ryan. Is everyone? We've got, what about the resources one? We covered that on the, we covered that with the corporate one, didn't we? Yeah. That's lovely. Well, just to sum up, Debbie, I think obviously we have the similar issues that we probably alluded to last time when we met, but they're long-term ones. I mean, our key risks, such as cybersecurity and things, aren't going to reduce. Safeguarding children, again, that's always, and adults are going to be at the top of our list, whatever. The business world, and I think it's prudent. I don't know what we would suggest that, in view of the experience we've had before, to be thorough and make sure we proceed and tick all the boxes as we're going along with that one, as with the other transformation programmes like smarter working and those sort of things. So,
Yeah, great. Thank you. It's been a really good session. I've really enjoyed it. And just to say, you know, I mean, I lived through some of the challenges in terms of when the pay was last time changed over the system, and still etched on my memory. So absolutely do not want to go there again, not at all.
No, it's very, very complicated procedure, and I think we'd underestimate that at our power already. It's a, but very difficult to transfer the systems across. That's wonderful. Thank you so much to all the contributors on the combined assurance report. Very much appreciated. And I think, as we said, we've had some good discussions around that and got some good assurances there. So, in terms of the agenda, if we could, members, move on to to item 5, which is the draft audit committee annual report, which I shall be presenting, subject to your approval, at the full council on the 18th. So, could I have any comments regarding this, please? Obviously, there's been no surprises report. It is our report on what we've done over the last, actually slightly more than 12 months, and we've had to sort of retime the reporting in line with our reporting criteria for other things. We wouldn't have had the audit report to append to the end, for instance.
No, I think that was probably the only thing I just needed to remind you about, Chair, is that the audit report being attached to your audit report effectively is a new requirement from the national guidance, and just really to emphasise that the council just need to be made aware that it's now a requirement for them to see that audit report, and you're presenting it on behalf of the committee. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Michelle. But that makes that's a sensible move, really. I mean, bear in mind, because they you know, a member of the public or fellow members, whatever, can compare those two reports. So, do I have any comments or suggestions for amendments? Mark.
Chairman, I think the report is fine. It does what's needed. I just got a couple of clarifications. If somebody could pick those up, one of which is with Mazars, and one of which is probably with you, Michelle. And it's really just a point of interest. Page 9.
Page 9. Is this a reasonable comment? Or the unreasonable comment?
I was just wondering I've tried to find. I've just found it and now I've lost it again. It's page 7. Sorry.
Okay.
The chairman's got an introduction. Which finishes at the end of page 6, I think.
Yeah, the reasonable shirts at the top.
So I was just wondering whose is the overall opinion, particularly with this reasonable assurance comment in it. Although I have seen that it's got the star, and a reasonable assurance is still quite a good one. It just looks odd when you read it first time round. So whose is that opinion, as a matter of interest?
I believe it's the opinion of the committee, isn't it?
Is it
well,
the chairman's?
To give the opinion of the committee.
Is it the chairman's or is it the committee's?
It's the committee's.
The heading at the top of that page said the audit committee is the council's watchdog, and the narrative that follows on from that. Lucy could probably explain this much better than me, but my view
I think Lucy's. So if we're looking at it in the word reasonable, I think that's probably looking at it probably in a more of an auditing context.
Yes.
We're just trying to put it into, frame it into. I mean, we could do the sort of high, medium, low levels of assurance, but that's not really putting it into common parlance, if you want to.
I just want to
the narrative says it's the committee's.
It says reasonable assurance is a high level of assurance, which is what's important.
Yeah, so this is the committee's view, given the information that you've been passed through the external audit, the internal audit reports, the combined assurance.
So, as a committee member, and anybody asks me what that means, I must remember the star and then qualify it. Reasonable is still very good.
Where I can point out at when I present it full council, yes. Good idea. Yeah, so it's not. I think we don't want to get into, jargon really, but yeah, it's just.
My second question, Chairman, was in on page 1 of the supporting report from Mazars, and it was to do with the 3 points in the introduction, and it's the last one, which is wider reporting responsibilities, which says in the report, the external auditor's report that goes to council, it says we have not completed our work on the council's, and I'm must admit, I always have problems reading the Massage
So
report because
which
they
one of our page references are we talking about? The bold pages at the bottom?
they do have such small writing. So it's just that.
Oh, because you don't have the printout. Sorry. I do apologise.
It's just that it means there is something that's missing from the report. It's given that they have given reasons why there is that comment in it, and I take it every single external auditor's report that's provided has that same comment in it. So it's not something that puts Lincolnshire in any particular sort of bad view.
Sorry, if I can just clarify, you're talking about the element that says about the wider reporting responsibilities?
It's to do with the wider reporting responsibilities, which obviously we have not done.
No, they haven't done the work on the whole of government accounts.
Which is, I think, was the question you were asking me earlier.
They haven't done the work because the government haven't asked them to do it, and we haven't done it because we haven't been told what's needed to be done.
And
so
the question I was asking Michelle, is that going to be similar sort of comment in every single local authorities report accounts because of the same reason?
Yes, it's a national thing.
It's again not something that puts us in a particularly bad shape.
So the whole of government accounts is a direct from the government, and it's to bring together all of the public authority bodies' finances into one place. I think the reason that government have said they've not asked for that is because of some of the delays in the audits from some of the bodies in that group. But we haven't even been asked to fill in the whole of government accounts for that period.
It just makes our life difficult, doesn't it?
It makes the auditors' life difficult because they can't actually finish the audit effectively. But we can't finish our work either. But I'm not sure, we've had no indication when government are going to ask us for that. But it is part of the auditor's responsibility to sign off our input into the whole of government accounts, and we haven't been asked to do it, so they can't audit it. But it's a national thing, it's not...
Yeah. Well, is it something that Ms. Ars could answer? You know, have they got this comment in every... Because they do a whole lot of these audit reports, don't they?
Yes, so Ms. Ars aren't present.
Is it going universally into the reporting system?
I can ask them if it's the same comment presented in all of their reports. I can ask them that, absolutely.
Thank you.
Chair.
Thank you, Andrew.
Well, I share Councillor Allen's curiosity about reasonable assurance, but the asterisk does put it in context. I think we've got to accept that the audit world is rather an understated assurance world. They don't like to use, I'm more familiar with Ofsted type grades and reasonable would be only equivalent to requires improvement in Ofsted terms, and then it's good and outstanding above that. But we're not going to get outstanding. So I think we've got to become correct with that. My comment, Chair, is I'm intrigued by the symbolism of the cover pictures. Is there a lot of thought gone into those pictures? Because we could have a interpret the picture competition, couldn't
well, we could, but it just is pleasing on the eye, I think, Andrew. I think that could, but yeah, we could interpret it as that. Yeah, it's to make it look. Yeah, it's to make it look appealing. Okay, is everyone happy with that? For me to, we can finalise that. I can present it to the full council. Yes. Okay, that's lovely. Yes, and then we'll. And then the last thing on the agenda, item 6, is the work programme. Are we all happy with that? Okay, we're all happy with it? Okay. Do I have a show of hands to approve that? Do you want to come in, Michelle?
Yeah, I think just to say that we've obviously been in discussions about how that work programme carries on in terms of the new deadline for the accounts and where that fits into the work programme. We're still planning to do the session with the audit committee looking at the draft statements in July, as we have done in previous years. So all of that will be filled in the work programme for the next meeting.
Thank you. With that comment, Peter.
Yeah, just I probably need to pop an apology out here. A couple of meetings ago, I made strong comments regarding the slow progress of this report. I know there was a lot of comments made. And if that affected any officers, I'll apologise. it wasn't meant that way, but we were getting late, weren't we? But saying that, it's always great to get to this point, you know, for finance officers and audit members, really, to get to this stage. And it goes, it's only thanks to Michelle and Lucy and Andrew, keep forgetting Andrew. So, and a lot of staff behind you as well. So that, you know, that's good. So, you know, put that out there. I'm sure committee members will be happy with those comments. All right, there's no surprises. It's a good level of assurance. So worth waiting for, and I'm sure your presentation, Madam Chair, will go quite easily at full council.
Yeah, okay, that's
Thank
fantastic. Yeah. Okay. Right, with that, ladies and gentlemen, I think we're concluded. So I'll now close the meeting and thank everyone for attending. Thank you. Thank you.